The thunderhead did not move. It sat above the jagged teeth of Coyote's gate like a giant, bruised fist, refusing to strike, refusing to leave. Below it, the New Mexico territory baked in the oppressive, silent heat of a held breath. Wind, hot and gritty, raked through the silver thread wash, combing the scorched grass and whispering lies of rain to the thirsty land. It was a sky that promised violence but offered no relief. Tessa Lockhart squinted, one eye closed against the glare, and saw the world framed in the ground glass of her view camera, a world of bleached bone and iron-red rock, tilted and upside down. Her subject was a distant trestle, a raw scar of new timber stretched across a deep gorge. Men, small as insects from this distance, moved with the rhythmic, ant-like purpose of a force that believed itself inevitable. The ringing of their spike mauls on steel was a faint, metallic heartbeat carried on the wind, the pulse of Silas Vane's railroad, the very thing that was choking this land to death. She adjusted the focus, the image of the distant workers sharpening into painful clarity. Her hands, stained with silver nitrate and collodion, moved with an economy born of long practice. Every motion was precise, a ritual against the encroaching chaos of her situation. 20 yards away, her wagon sat at a defeated angle, a monument to her predicament. The left rear wheel, its spokes shattered, had surrendered to a deep rut 3 miles back. Her mule, Jezebel, stood tethered to a salt cedar, her long ears twitching in protest at the heat, the flies, and the general injustice of the universe. Just one more. Jezebel, Tessa murmured, her voice a dry rasp. One more plate, then we'll figure out the wheel. She slid a prepared glass plate into the camera back, her head disappearing under the heavy black focusing cloth. The world outside vanished, replaced by the contained, inverted image on the glass. The smell of ether and alcohol was sharp in the enclosed space, a familiar, acrid perfume in this small, dark world. She was in control. Here, she could capture the truth, trap it in a wash of chemicals, and hold it up to the light. In the heavy leather saddlebag slung over the wagon's broken side was a different kind of truth. It was a roll of oilskin, tied with a leather thong. Inside was her father's last survey, a meticulous grid of lines and figures, measurements taken with chain and transit under this same unforgiving sun. His elegant, scholarly hand had noted the flow rates, the water table depths, the undeniable evidence that the silver thread wash was not the seasonal trickle Silas Vane claimed it to be in his filings. It was a perennial stream, the lifeblood of every small rancher in this valley. Her father's work was proof. It was her legacy. And Vane had stolen it, using a forged survey to claim the water for his railroad. Bleating the valley dry to feed his iron horse, he had stolen the water, and in doing so, had stolen the future. This photograph, this distant trestle, was just one more piece of her indictment. She uncapped the lens, counting the seconds in her head, the rhythm as familiar as her own breathing. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. The light burned the image onto the wet plate, a permanent ghost of Vane's ambition. She capped the lens, her work done for the moment. The truth was captured. Now she just had to find a way to make someone listen. A mile east, at the edge of the Mesquite Crossing Ranch, Gideon Rourke was also holding his breath. He stood in the center of a circular corral, the dust a fine powder under his worn boots. His world was not an inverted image on glass. It was the tense, explosive reality of 1,000 pounds of terrified muscle and bone. The horse was a killer Mustang, a black devil with a white blaze like a lightning strike and eyes that rolled to show the whites, promising a swift and violent end to anyone foolish enough to get close. Gideon wasn't close. He wasn't far. He just was. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed, his hands held low and open at his sides. They were hands that looked like they had been carved from old leather and cured over a slow fire. scarred with the memory of rope burns and splinters. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a snow, held no challenge. They simply watched, patient and unwavering. He had been in this corral since sunup, moving when the horse moved, stopping when it stopped, mirroring its breath until the animal's panic began to subside, replaced by a wary, exhausted curiosity. This was his language. Not words, but breath. Not force, but patience. The Mustang snorted, a plume of dust rising from the corral floor. It took a hesitant step toward him, then another. Its ears, which had been pinned back in aggression, flickered forward. Gideon didn't move. He let the horse close the distance. He was not a conqueror. He was a whisper, a suggestion of peace in a world of noise and fear. He gentled horses not by breaking their spirit, but by convincing them there was nothing to fear from him. It was a trust he rarely, if ever, extended to his own kind. The sudden, frantic sound shattered the stillness. It came from the west, from the direction of the wash, the high-pitched, panicked braying of a mule, followed by the splintering crack of wood and a woman's sharp cry. Gideon's head snapped up. The Mustang, startled, shied away, its brief moment of trust broken. But Gideon's focus was already elsewhere. He moved with a speed that belied his calm demeanor, vaulting over the corral fence in a single fluid motion. He saw it all in a heartbeat: the photographer's wagon, the busted wheel, and the source of the commotion. A stray stallion, its coat the color of dried blood, had bolted from a box canyon, wild and untamed. It had charged too close to the woman's camp. Her mule, Jezebel, had panicked, pulling hard against its tether. The harness had snapped, and the woman, who had been standing beside the wagon, was thrown off balance. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing, right toward the crumbling edge of a deep, rock-strewn arroyo. Tessa felt the ground give way beneath her heel. One moment she was fighting for balance on solid earth. The next, there was nothing but air. The sky and the red rock walls of the arroyo swapped places in a dizzying, sickening lurch. Her mind registered the fall, the sharp rocks below, the finality of it, all in the space of a single, stolen breath. Then something hit her, hard. It wasn't the ground. It was a solid weight that wrapped around her waist, cinching tight and driving the air from her lungs in a painful whoosh. The rope pulled taut, arresting her fall with a brutal, spine-jarring jolt. She dangled, spinning slowly, a foot from the edge, her boots scuffing against the loose rock of the arroyo wall. She looked up, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man stood on the precipice, his boots planted wide, holding the other end of the lariat. He was tall, built lean and hard like the windmills that dotted this territory. He hauled her in with 2 powerful pulls, his movements efficient and utterly without ceremony. He deposited her on the ground, a few safe feet from the edge, like a sack of flour. Tessa scrambled to her feet, brushing dust from her trousers, her face hot with a mixture of terror, relief, and pure, undiluted indignation. Her camera, her plates, her dignity, all were in jeopardy. "I had it under control," she said, her voice shaking slightly. The man recoiled his rope with a series of smooth, practiced flicks of his wrist. He didn't look at her. His gaze was on the mule, which was now trembling but standing its ground, the stray stallion having already disappeared into the mesquite. "Looked to me like you were having a serious talk with gravity," he grunted, his voice a low baritone. "Rough as burlap. Mules get scared. Gravity always wins the argument." Before Tessa could form a retort, the sound of hoofbeats drew both their heads around. 3 riders crested the nearby rise, their horses kicking up a cloud of ochre dust. They weren't cowboys. They wore matching dusters and carried themselves with the lazy arrogance of men who were paid to be mean. They rode straight for a massive, ancient cottonwood tree that stood sentinel over the wash, its leaves silver in the harsh sunlight. The lead rider, a man with a cruel twist to his mouth, dismounted. He pulled a piece of paper and a hammer from his saddlebag. As his companions watched, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols, he nailed the notice to the trunk of the old tree. The sound of the hammer blows was sharp and ugly in the quiet air, an act of violation. Gideon's jaw tightened. He knew those men, Barlow Crick and his crew, Vane's men. Once the paper was secured, the riders mounted up and trotted away without a word, heading back east. They left the white square of the notice fluttering against the bark like a trapped soul, curiosity overriding her anger. Tessa walked toward the tree. Gideon followed a few paces behind, his quiet fury a palpable thing, a pressure in the air. The notice was printed in stark, black letters. At the top was the seal of the New Mexico Territorial Land Office, and below it, the words that were a death sentence to this valley. Notice of eminent domain. It declared the lands of Mesquite Crossing Ranch and all adjacent properties seized for the purpose of constructing a railroad reservoir. All occupants were to vacate the premises within 30 days. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. 30 days. It was a land grab, pure and simple, sanctioned by a piece of paper. But then her photographer's eye, trained to see the minute details others missed, snagged on the seal. It was an official surveyor's seal, an embossed circle with an eagle in the center. But within the circle, where the surveyor's initials should be, were the letters A.L. Her father's initials were A.L. For Arthur James Lockhart. She leaned closer. The J was missing. The spacing subtly wrong. The embossing was just a little too shallow. It was a forgery, a clumsy, arrogant forgery, mimicking her father's seal to grant Vane's theft the veneer of legitimacy. It was a desecration of his name, his work, his memory. A cold, sharp rage, clearer and more potent than her earlier indignation, settled deep in her bones. Beside her, Gideon reached out and tore the notice from the tree. The paper ripped with a satisfying snarl. He crumpled it in his fist, his knuckles white. The fury in his eyes was like a fire banked low, all heat and no flame, more dangerous for being contained. For a moment, Tessa thought he would ride after the men, that the violence promised by the brooding sky was about to break. Instead, he took a deep, steadying breath. His fist uncurled. He carefully smoothed the crumpled paper against the tree trunk and, using the same nail Crick had driven, tacked it back into place. Tessa stared at him, bewildered. "What are you doing? They're stealing your land." "A fight you declare out loud is a fight you've already lost," Gideon said, his voice low and tight. "It just tells them where to aim. Gets men buried." He turned and walked back toward his corral, his shoulders set, his silence more eloquent than any shout. A fight declared too soon gets men buried. It wasn't a proverb. It sounded like a memory. From a high, sun-baked ridge half a mile away, Flint Mallory lowered his spyglass. He had seen it all. The broken-down wagon, the woman with the strange box on a tripod, the horsebreaker from Mesquite Crossing. He had watched the brief, chaotic dance with the arroyo, the efficient rescue. He had seen Roark tear the notice down and, more importantly, had seen him put it back up, prudent, dangerous. Mallory made a note in a small leather-bound book. Woman, photographer. Equipment appears professional. Potential journalist Roark, not easily provoked, calculated. He snapped the book shut. Silas Vane paid him to notice things, to assess threats. A woman with a camera and a quiet man with a rope and a long memory. Together, they were an unknown quantity. And Flint Mallory did not like unknown quantities. Night fell, not with a gentle fade, but like a thrown sheet. The wind picking up, blowing grit that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. The dry thunderhead overhead began to mutter, distant flickers of lightning illuminating its dark underbelly. The temperature dropped, and the vast, empty loneliness of the land asserted itself. Tessa had tried, and failed, to fix the wheel. She needed a forge, tools, and a skill she didn't possess. Defeated, She walked toward the distant silhouette of the Mesquite Crossing ranch house. The only sign of life was a single point of yellow light coming from a small, dilapidated cabin set apart from the main buildings. A lined shack. She found Gideon there, sharpening a blade on a whetstone. The shack was sparse, containing little more than a cot, a small table, and the smell of coffee and oiled leather. "I need a wheelwright," she said, standing in the doorway, not wanting to intrude. "Is there one in Coyote's Gate?" He didn't look up from his stone. "No, closest is Santa Fe." "Santa Fe, that's a week's ride from here." Her heart sank. He finished his work, wiping the blade on a rag. He finally met her eyes. His were impossible to read. "I've got a forge, tools, I can fix it." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. "I'll pay you, of course." She reached for the small coin purse at her belt. He stood up, his height seeming to fill the small shack. "Keep your coin," he said, his voice flat. "You can use the shack for the night. I'll see to the wheel in the morning." He moved past her, out into the darkness, as if her presence physically pained him. He stopped at the edge of the light spilling from the doorway and looked back. "But keep your distance." He disappeared into the night, leaving her alone in the borrowed light of his shack. Tessa watched him go, a strange mix of gratitude and irritation churning within her. She looked around the small, solitary space he inhabited, a life stripped down to the barest essentials. Distance. That was the currency he dealt in. She muttered to the empty doorway, to the wind that carried her words into the dark. "Distance is easy. Silence is the trick." As if in answer, a brilliant, jagged fork of lightning split the sky directly overhead. The thunder that followed was not a distant rumble, but a sharp, instantaneous crack, like the gavel of a judge calling a final, terrible court to order. The line shack was not built for two people. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence about solitude, containing one narrow cot, one small, three-legged table, and a single tin of Arbuckle's coffee. The roof, made of poorly laid shingles, complained under the assault of the returning rain, a steady, miserable dripping that found 3 separate places to land on the packed earth floor. By the time Tessa had dragged her heavy wooden chemical boxes in from the wagon, the interior was already thick with a palpable, shared awkwardness. Gideon Rourke had said, "Keep your distance." Yet they were now confined to a space 10 feet square. The storm had trapped them, 2 wary animals forced to share the same small cave. She set about her work with a focused, deliberate intensity that was itself a wall. "I'll need the table," she said, not asking. He was already at the door, pulling on a worn duster. "Don't poison the water bucket." He gestured with his chin toward the forge, a crude setup of stone and a hand-cranked bellows sheltering under a flimsy lean-to. "Your wheel will be done by morning." He stepped out into the rain, leaving her with the shack. She was grateful for the space, for the absence of his unsettling, quiet presence. She hung a blanket over the single window, plunging the room into near total darkness. From her kit, she produced a small, ruby-colored lantern. When she lit the wick, the shack was transformed, bathed in a low, hellish light that made the shadows dense and alive. This was her sanctuary. She began the ritual, her hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. She poured the collodion, thick and smelling of ether, onto a clean glass plate, tilting it carefully to coat the surface in a perfect, viscous sheet. She submerged it in the silver nitrate bath, counting the seconds. Then, she retrieved the plate she had exposed earlier, the one of the distant trestle. She slid it into a tray of developer. The room was silent save for the drumming rain and the faint hiss of her chemicals. Slowly, as if summoned from a shroud, the image began to emerge, chemical ghosts swimming into view, the raw timber of the trestle, the dark, ant-like figures of the men. And there, almost too small to see but sharp and clear to her practiced eye, a banner snapping in a wind she couldn't hear. It carried the name Vane, and the sharp, arrogant eagle of the railroad. She worked, a priestess in a ruby-red cell, fixing the image, washing it, her mind focused on the captured truth. This was not art, it was evidence. Outside, a different, more violent ritual was taking place. The rhythmic, percussive clang of a hammer on an anvil cut through the sound of the storm. Gideon was at the forge, the bellows roaring, the coals glowing a furious orange against the gray, wet twilight. He had brought the shattered wheel close. He was not a man who was gentle with anything but horses. He was at war with the broken iron, his arm rising and falling, beating the metal into submission. He worked with a grim focus, the heat from the forge turning the rain to steam as it hit his shoulders. He spoke only to the iron, his voice a low growl lost in the noise. "Bend. That's it. Hold. You'll hold." He trusted metal. Metal told the truth. It bent, it broke, or it held. It never lied, never forged a survey, never stole a man's water. It was honest in its failures and absolute in its strength. He finished forging the new rivet, his face slick with sweat and rain. He quenched the glowing metal in a bucket, a furious hiss rising into the air. He needed to brace the spoke, and the tools he needed were inside the shack. He pushed the door open without knocking, stopping on the threshold. The sight brought him up short. The room was a blood-red cave, the air thick with chemical smells that stung his throat. Tessa was bent over a tray, her face illuminated from below, intent and strange, like a woman reading fortunes in a pool of ink. She looked up, startled, her eyes adjusting to the dark figure in the doorway. "I'm almost done." He nodded, stepping inside. The tiny room shrank by half. They moved around each other in a clumsy, silent ballet. She, protecting her trays on the table. He, trying to reach a wooden toolbox under the cot. As he bent, his wet shirt, already plastered to his back, pulled taut. He reached for the box, and the fabric hitched, lifting for just a second. In the dim, red light, Tessa saw it. A shocking ladder of white, puckered scars, climbing his ribs from his belt to his armpit, disappearing under his arm. It was old, long-heeled, but brutal. The rungs of the ladder were uneven, as if something had tried to tear its way out of him. She drew a breath, her professional detachment vanishing. "My God, what happened to you?" He froze, his hand on the toolbox. He didn't turn. He just remained, half-bent, a statue of tension. "Carson Range," he said, his voice flat. "A mining accident." Something like that. He pulled the box free, straightened up, and turned. His face was a mask, his eyes holding hers in the ruby light, daring her to ask another question. The wall of his silence was absolute. He took a small file from the box and walked back out into the rain, the clang of his hammer resuming, a sound of punctuation. "The conversation is over." She finished her work, carefully packing her plates into slotted, protective boxes. She cleaned the table, put out the lantern, and took the blanket from the window. The gray, watery light of evening filled the shack again, making it look even more stark and poor. The rain settled into a steady, relentless downpour. Finally, the hammering stopped. The door opened, and Gideon entered, dripping. He didn't look at her. He went to the small, pot-bellied stove, shook his head no wood dry enough, and then turned his attention to the coffee tin. Tessa found her voice. "I can make that." "Don't need you to. It's the least I can do. You're fixing my wagon. You gave me your shelter." He stopped, his hand on the tin. He seemed to consider this a transaction. He grunted and stepped back, ceding the small corner by the stove to her. She filled the pot with water from the bucket he'd indicted, added grounds with a heavy hand, and set it on the stove, knowing it would take forever to get even lukewarm without a fire. They waited in silence. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the slow, steady drip, drip, drip onto the floor. "You've been gentling that black Mustang for a while," she said, trying to fill the void. "The one with the white blaze." He was staring at a spot on the wall, his thoughts 100 miles away. "He's got a mean streak, been spoiled by bad handling." "He's magnificent. What do you call him?" Gideon's gaze shifted from the wall to her. His eyes were clear, cold, and held no warmth at all. "Don't call him—" "Every animal needs a name," she countered, trying to keep her tone light. "No, it doesn't." "Why not? It gives them a personality." He looked back at the wall, his voice low. "Names make leave-taking harder. You name it, you start to think it belongs to you. Nothing belongs to you out here, not the land, not the horse. You just borrow it for a while." The words landed with a thud, and Tessa fell silent. She thought of her father's name on a forged document, of Silas Vane naming a reservoir after himself. The coffee was finally warm, though not hot. She poured the sludgy, bitter liquid into 2 tin cups. She held one out to him. For a second, he just looked at it. His first instinct, the habit of a lifetime, was to refuse, to accept nothing. But he was cold, soaked to the bone, and the faint plume of steam promised warmth. He reached out and took the cup. His scarred fingers, calloused and rough, brushed hers. It was a tiny, accidental contact, but it felt as loud as a gunshot in the small room. He declined, then he accepted, then he said nothing. He leaned against the wall and drank. She sat on the edge of the cot. The coffee was terrible, grounds and all, but it was hot. It was a truce. The cup was conversation enough. They drank in a silence that was no longer hostile, but simply shared. Her gaze drifted to her camera case. The pull was irresistible. This man, this light, this moment of guarded truce. He was the human equivalent of the landscape, harsh, scarred, and refusing to be tamed. She began, as if idly, to wipe the lens of her smaller, portable viewing camera. "I'm a photographer," she said, as if stating the obvious. "I capture things. It's what I do." He watched her. His eyes narrowed. "I'm not a thing. You're here. The light is interesting." She raised the camera, framing him. He immediately turned his head, breaking the pose, presenting her with nothing but his stubborn profile and the line of his jaw. "Don't!" The word was not a request. "Why not?" she challenged, her eyes still pressed to the viewfinder. "Are you afraid I'll steal your soul?" "Don't have one to steal," he muttered, turning his back to her completely, facing the window. "Just don't like being aimed at." She lowered the camera, frustrated, but she was a professional. She had her pride. She raised it again, quickly. He was still turned away, a dark silhouette against the gray. Rainy world. It was a picture of refusal. It was perfect. She snapped the shutter. The loud, mechanical click of the mechanism was an explosion in the tiny shack. Gideon flinched, his shoulders tensing as if he'd been struck. He turned slowly, his face thunderous. It was, she realized, the first mechanical click that had startled him in years. He lived in a world of horse breaths and wind. Her machine was a violation. "You took it," he stated. "I did," she said, not backing down. He held her gaze for a long, heavy moment, then let out a breath, a sigh of pure exasperation. He shook his head and turned back to the window, defeated by an audacity he didn't understand. Later, when the light had almost completely failed, she went back under the ruby lantern to develop the plate. The image of the man swam up out of the chemicals. It wasn't just the stubborn silhouette. The weak light had caught the exhaustion in his shoulders, the tension in his neck, the way he stood as if braced for a blow. Her plate revealed a man built like a windmill, tall, necessary, and pathologically, stubbornly, rooted to his spot. She felt a pang of guilt. She had captured him, trapped him in silver nitrate, and it felt like a kind of theft. Night fell. The rain eased to a drizzle. Outside, the coyotes began to stitch the black fabric of the night with their thin, yipping needles. Inside, the two strangers had learned the boundaries of the other's silence. The problem of the cot remained. It was the only bed. Gideon, who had been staring at the cold stove for an hour, finally nodded toward it. "You take it." Tessa shook her head, her pride stinging. She was a guest, but she was not Charity. "I won't take your bed. The bench is fine." The bench was a hard, narrow plank of raw timber, barely a foot wide. "Suit yourself," he grunted. She settled onto the bench, pulling her own blanket from her pack. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and pretended to be comfortable. The wood dug into her spine. She heard him moving. The floorboards creaked. She opened her eyes. He was standing by the door, pulling on his damp duster. "Where are you going?" she asked, sitting up. "Out. Out where it's raining. It's dark." "Better than in here." He opened the door, and a rush of cold, damp air filled the shack. He stepped out and pulled the door shut, leaving her in total darkness. She sat on the bench, furious. At him for his mule-headed pride, at herself for hers. He had left. He had actually left, gone to sleep in a barn or just walk in the rain rather than share this small space. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip. He wasn't coming back. With a sigh of frustration, she stood up. It was foolish for both of them to be miserable. She moved to the cot. The wool blanket was rough, but it smelled faintly of him wood smoke, horse, and the faint, metallic tang of his forge. She lay down, the narrow bed surprisingly comfortable, and pulled the blanket over her. She must have drifted off. She was woken by the sound of the door opening, a soft creak of wood. She tensed, her eyes flying open. He was silhouetted in the doorway, a man made of shadows and rain. He stood there for a long moment, watching her. She didn't move. Her breath caught in her throat. He stepped inside, closing the door as silently as he could. He was soaked, water streaming from his duster. He didn't light a lamp. In the pitch black, she heard him take the other thin blanket from its peg. She heard the small, weary groan as he settled himself on the floor, his back against the wall by the cold stove. He had never intended to leave. He had just gone out into the rain to give her time to take the cot without an argument. He had returned, soaked to the skin, to take the floor. He had, in his own stubborn, silent way, been a gentleman. She lay in the dark, listening to the roof complain and the sound of the man on the floor breathing. A steady, quiet rhythm. She was safe. The thought was so strange, so unwelcome. It made her heart ache. She thought of Vane, of the forged seal, of the long, impossible fight ahead. Before sleep finally caught her, she whispered to the leaking roof, a vow to the darkness. "I'm not running this time." The shack and the man pretending to be asleep on the floor kept her secret. Dawn broke not with color, but with a change in pressure. The air, washed clean by the night storm, was now thin and sharp, carrying the smell of wet greasewood and cold iron. Gideon was already at the forge. The broken wagon wheel braced, the metal heating in a fresh bed of glowing coals. He had slept for perhaps an hour, his back against the wall, his mind cataloging the new, dangerous variable that was Tessa Lockhart. She complicated things. She was a spark near a dry fuse. He heard them before he saw them. The sound was wrong. Not the rhythmic, ambling pace of ranch hands, but the confident, arrogant tread of shod horses coming on fast. He looked up, his hand stopping on the bellows crank. Tessa emerged from the line shack, her hair pulled back, her face scrubbed clean. She, too, heard it. She shaded her eyes against the new, flat light. 3 riders crested the small rise by the cottonwood tree, exactly as they had the day before, but this time, a 4th man was with them. Barlow Crick, Vane's foreman, was in the lead, his mouth already twisted in a sneer. The two deputies flanked him. The fourth man hung back, dressed in a city-cut coat that looked out of place, his gaze sharp and methodical. Flint Mallory, the Pinkerton. Gideon left the forge, the hammer still in his hand. He didn't walk toward them. He moved to the corral, his back against the rail, his body language a study in defensive calm. He placed his left hand on the neck of the black Mustang, the one that had been his sole focus for days. The horse sensed his tension and snorted, its skin quivering. Gideon's presence was the only thing keeping it from exploding. He held the hammer in his right hand, its weight familiar, its balance perfect. "Mornin', Rourke," Crick called out, his voice oily with false cheer. He dismounted, letting his reins drop. "Got some papers for you." Tessa moved to stand in the doorway of the shack, her arms crossed. She was not invited into this conversation, but she would not be hidden from it. "I'm not interested in your papers," Gideon said. His voice was flat, carrying easily in the still air. "Oh, you'll be interested in this," Crick said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "It's a writ of temporary ingress, legal and proper, signed by the judge himself. We've got a survey crew coming through. We need access to your pastures, your well, effective immediately." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Ingress, that's a new word for invasion." While Crick postured, Flint Mallory dismounted. He moved with a quiet, fluid grace, his eyes never settling, cataloging everything. He noted the forge. He noted Gideon's grip on the hammer. He noted the Mustang and the way Gideon used it as a living shield. And then his gaze slid past Gideon to the woman in the doorway. He walked, not toward Gideon, but directly toward the line shack. Tessa felt her stomach tighten. She did not move. Mallory stopped a foot from her, tipping his hat. It was a gesture of mocking courtesy. "Ma'am, Flint Mallory. I'm a private security consultant for the railroad, just ensuring a smooth transition." "There is no transition," Tessa said, her voice cold. "Of course there is." Mallory smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. He looked past her, into the shack. His eyes, quick and sharp, took in the chemical boxes, the ruby lantern, the slotted crate where she stored her glass plates. "You're a long way from a portrait studio." He stepped inside, an invasion of the small space. Tessa was forced to step back or be touched. She seethed. "My equipment was damaged in my accident," she said, forcing a note of frustration into her voice. "I was just checking my supplies." Mallory ran a gloved finger along the edge of her plate box. "Photography. It's a messy business." He lifted a plate from the slot, the plate she had taken of Gideon's back, the silhouette against the rain. He held it up to the light. "It's a ruined experiment," Tessa snapped, her heart hammering. "The light is too harsh in this territory. Nothing turns out. I've wasted a week's worth of chemicals." Mallory looked from the plate to her, his smile broadening. He didn't believe her for a second. "A ruined experiment, I see." He slid the plate into his own coat pocket. "I'll keep it, a souvenir of your failure." Outside, the confrontation was escalating. "You're not deaf, are you, Rourke?" Crick said, stepping closer to Gideon. "I said, we're coming through. You can sign this paper, acknowledging the writ. Or we can make it difficult. Your choice." "There is no choice." Gideon said, "You're not setting foot on this ranch." "That's where you're wrong." Crick's temper, always simmering, finally boiled over. He was tired of the quiet man, tired of his refusal. He lunged forward and shoved Gideon, hard, in the center of his chest. "You don't have a say." It was a mistake. Gideon braced, stumbled back a single step, but the black Mustang, already wound tight by the tension, exploded. It was not a simple rearing. It was a scream of pure, equine fury, 1,000 pounds of muscle launching skyward, its front hooves lashing out, its teeth bared. Barlow Crick cried out, a high, strangled sound, and threw himself backward. He tripped over his own spurs and went down, landing flat on his back in the mud and horse manure. He crab-walked backward, his face ashen, as the Mustang's hooves struck the ground where he had been standing, the impact shaking the earth. Gideon didn't flinch. He spoke a single, low word to the horse, his hand still on its neck, and the animal, snorting and wild-eyed, settled, though its flanks were covered in a trembling sweat. One of the deputies let out a sharp bark of laughter. The other snickered. Crick, covered in filth, his dignity gone, was a ridiculous sight. "Shut up," Mallory said, emerging from the shack. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but the laughter died as if it had been strangled. Crick scrambled to his feet, his face purple with a humiliation that was far more dangerous than his anger. He pointed a shaking, muddy finger at Gideon. "You think you're clever, Rourke, you and your trick horse." He pulled his pistol from its holster, not to aim it, but to gesture with it. "Here's the new terms. You sign this paper, or we're tearing down this corral. Right now. You got till sundown to decide. Sundown." He holstered his weapon, snatched the writ from the ground, and slapped it against Gideon's chest. Gideon didn't move. The paper fell into the mud between them. "Sundown," Crick repeated, his voice venomous. He mounted his horse, the other men following. Mallory gave Tessa one last, thoughtful look, tipped his hat again, and they rode off, leaving the sodden paper lying in the dirt. For a long minute, there was only silence. Gideon stood, his knuckles white on the hammer, his chest rising and falling. He was shaking, a fine tremor of pure, suppressed rage. He wanted to kill them. He wanted to burn their world to the ground. Instead, he turned and slammed the hammer against the anvil. A single, ringing clang of frustration that echoed across the valley. "He took my plate," Tessa said, her voice tight. She was standing in the doorway, her own hands clenched. "I told you," Gideon growled, not looking at her. "I told you to keep your distance. Now you're not just a complication. You're a target. You're in it. He took your picture as a warning." "He took it because he's afraid of it," Tessa shot back, her mind racing. "He thinks I'm a journalist. He thinks I'm documenting this." She stepped out of the shack, her eyes scanning the ground, following the path the riders had taken. They had ridden in from the east, along the shallow ridge that marked the edge of the wash. She stopped, her gaze fixed on something that didn't belong. It was a flicker of new wood, 50 yards away, pounded into the damp earth. "What is that?" Gideon followed her gaze. "Nothing. A stick." "No." She began walking toward it, her pace quickening. It wasn't a stick. It was a surveyor's pin. Four-sided, shaved from new oak, with a small brass cap on top. It had been pounded deep into the ground, and the mud around it was freshly disturbed. It was miles from the actual legal line of the Mesquite Crossing Ranch. Miles. "They're not just trespassing," she whispered, her voice vibrating with a cold, clear fury. "They're redrawing the map. They're stealing your land right out from under you." She looked at the brass cap. Stamped into it were the railroad's eagle, and her father's forged initials. "My camera," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Get your boot?" Gideon stared at her, confused. "What?" "Your boot? Put it next to the pin. I need it for scale." Understanding dawned on him, but he argued out of sheer habit. "And what good will that do? It's a picture. Their paper beats your picture." "Just do it." He strode to the pin and placed his heavy, worn boot in the mud right beside it. Tessa was already there, her tripod legs sinking into the ground. She disappeared under the black cloth. The world went silent, upside down, and focused. There it was, the lie, inarguable, the brass cap, the freshly turned earth, And Gideon's boot, solid, real, defiant, proof of ownership, proof of the crime. Right in the frame. She uncapped the lens. 1,000, 1,000, 3. Click. She emerged, pulling the plate holder. I've got it. Gideon looked from her to the pin, and then to the distant trestle. He finally understood. This was not a hobby. This was a war. And she had just fired the first real shot. You're painting targets, photographer, he said, his voice rough. On your back, on mine. They already painted them, Mr. Rourke, she retorted, her hands deftly packing her plate. They painted them when they forged my father's seal. They painted them when they pounded this pin. I'm just developing the picture. He stared at her, this impossible, stubborn woman. She was right, and she was going to get them both killed. His protective instinct, an old, rusted thing he rarely used, warred with his desire to be left alone. I'll finish the wheel, now, he said, his voice decisive. I'll hitch your mule. I'll escort you to Coyote's gate. You find a judge. You give him that plate. His primary goal was clear, get her to safety. Get her out of his life, away from the danger. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. A judge in Coyote's gate, Silas Vane owns that judge. He owns the marshal. He owns the paper Crick was holding. Showing this plate to that judge will just tell Vane exactly what I have before he throws me in a cell. Or worse. Then what? He demanded. You'll stay here and wait for Crick to come back at sundown. They'll burn this place to the ground, with both of us in it. No, she said, her eyes flashing. She tapped the camera. We need more. That pin is proof, but it's quiet proof. We need loud proof. I don't do loud. He said, You won't have to. I will. She stepped closer to him. Give me 2 days. That's all I ask. They're not just putting in pins. Vane's men are doing something to the water. I know it. They're moving cattle. They're fouling wells. Give me 2 days to catch them in the act. Let me catch them cheating on glass. He was horrified. 2 days. They gave us till sundown. We don't have 2 days. We'll buy it, she insisted. We'll be shadows. They won't even know we're here. Then, when I have what I need, we don't go to Coyote's gate. We walk into town, and we go straight to the telegraph office. We walk in loud. Not with 1 plate, but with 12. We string them up for the whole town to see. We make a noise so loud that Santa Fe will have to listen. It was a stalemate. He didn't do loud. He was a man who hid in silence. She didn't do later. She was a woman running on borrowed time. He looked at her, at the raw, unbending certainty in her eyes. It was a stubbornness that mirrored his own. He knew, with a sinking final certainty, that she would not run. And he knew, with an even deeper sickness, that he could not abandon his home. He let out a long breath, scrubbing a hand over his face. 2 days, and you do exactly as I say. You stay out of sight. You make no sound. The second they see you, you're dead. Then I'll fix your wheel and you're gone. I'll be a shadow, she promised. Now, about that wheel. The pact was sealed, a grim, desperate alliance. By mid-afternoon, the air was thick and heavy again, promising more rain. Gideon worked at the forge, his movements precise and angry. The wheel was almost done. Tessa was cleaning her plates, preparing her chemicals for a war of shadows. The silence in the shack was tense, filled with their un-Gideon-said fears. Gideon finished setting the new rivet, quenching it with a hiss. I'm riding the west line, he announced. Crick's men cut fence. Tessa was on her feet instantly. I'm coming with you. No. Yes, you need a witness, and I need to see the land. I need to know where to hide. He wanted to argue, but he didn't have the energy, and she was right. He just nodded, curtly, and went to saddle his horse. They rode out, not toward the town, but west, into the broken country of canyons and arroyos. They found the fence. It hadn't just been cut, it had been torn down. The barbs dragged through the dirt. He dismounted, pulling tools from his saddlebag. "Barbed wire," he muttered. "Devil's rope. Fitting." He began the difficult work of stretching the wire, trying to splice the broken ends. The metal was taut, fighting him. He braced his boot against a post, pulled with the pliers, and the tool slipped on the wet metal. The wire sprang back, a vicious, living thing. A barb bit deep into the heel of his left palm, tearing through the calloused skin. He cursed a low, sharp sound and dropped the pliers. Blood welled up instantly, dark and thick, dripping onto the damp earth. Tessa was off her mule before he had even registered the pain. She had her satchel with her. "Let me see it." "It's a scratch," he growled, cradling his hand. She ignored him, grabbing his wrist. His hand was massive, scarred and hard as old wood, but the blood was bright and real. She pulled a clean strip of linen from her bag scraps she used for wiping her plates and a small brown bottle. "This is carbolic," she said, her voice all business. "It will sting." Before he could protest, she unstopped the bottle and poured the raw antiseptic directly into the wound. Gideon hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his whole body tensing. The sting was a white-hot fire, but he did not pull away. He just watched her. Her fingers were stained with silver nitrate, her nails short and practical, but they were impossibly steady. She worked with a focused, detached calm, cleaning the wound, her touch gentle but firm. He could smell the chemicals on her skin, a faint, sharp scent of ether and alcohol. He could see the line of her throat as she bent her head, the stray wisps of hair at her temple. He hadn't been tended to, touch this gently. He couldn't remember how long. A strange, unfamiliar heat flashed through him, starting in his chest and spreading outward. Having nothing to do with the carbolic, he was acutely aware of her fingers on his skin, of her proximity, of the fact that she was fixing something he had broken. She finished, wrapping the linen strip tightly around his palm, a clean white bandage against his grime-caked skin. "That should hold," she said, looking up. Her eyes met his. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable, his gaze intense. He snatched his hand back, as if burned. "It'll hold," he said, his voice thick. He turned back to the fence, his movements stiff. As if on cue, the sky, which had brooded all afternoon, finally broke. The dry thunderhead unleashed its reserves. It was a deluge, a cold, driving wall of water that hit them with physical force. "Back to the shack," Gideon yelled, already grabbing his horse's reins. They galloped back, not speaking, the world reduced to a gray, roaring chaos. They burst through the door of the line shack, slamming it shut against the storm. They stood dripping and breathless, laughing from the sheer, cold shock of it. The tiny room was instantly humid. Steam began to rise from their wet clothes. The smell of wet leather from his duster and wet wool from her skirt filled the air, mingling with the sharp mineral scent of the rain. They were suddenly, intensely close, breathing the same small pocket of air, their shoulders almost touching. Gideon soaked, his hair matted to his head, water dripping from his jaw, just watched her. She was alive, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with an exhilaration that defied their situation. She looked past him, through the open doorway, at the black Mustang, Shade, standing miserable in the corral, his head down, his coat plastered to his skin. A slow, challenging grin spread across Tessa's face. She was pushing the boundary, testing the ice. "You know," she said, her voice low and teasing, her eyes locked on his. "I'll ride you harder than that horse." The words hung in the humid air, a shocking, delightful blasphemy. He was stunned. He was a man accustomed to fear, or argument, or avoidance. He was not accustomed to this playful, dangerous, intimate fire. He felt a grin crack his own face. It was an unfamiliar movement, his muscles stiff from disuse. It wasn't a kind expression, it was quiet and hungry and stunned by its own existence. It changed his entire face, stripping away the harsh solitude, revealing something else beneath. He held her gaze, then took a single, deliberate step back, putting a foot of space between them, breaking the spell. The grin faded, but the heat remained in his eyes. His voice was a low rumble, a warning that was also an invitation. "Careful, photographer." He was not joking. Some colts don't take saddles easy. Outside, the storm kept the tempo, the rain drumming on the tin roof like a racing heartbeat, trapping them in the small, charged space. The challenge issued and accepted. The first day of their pact was a lesson in silence. Gideon moved through the broken country not like a man, but like an animal that had long ago learned the cost of a misplaced footfall. He led Tessa and her mule, Jezebel, along dry creek beds and through the skeletal remains of ancient piñon forests, always keeping to the low ground, always in shadow. He was teaching her a new language, one spoken not with the mouth, but with the body. A raised hand meant freeze, a low, sweeping gesture meant get down. 2 fingers pointed at his own eyes meant watch. Tessa, in turn, became a creature of shadow. She learned to lead Jezebel without a sound, her hand firm on the mule's muzzle. She learned to set up her tripod with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that made no noise. The landscape, which had seemed empty and hostile, revealed itself to be full of hiding places. The deep shade of a mesquite thicket, the hollowed-out belly of a sandstone overhang, the lee side of a ridge that blocked the view from the distant railroad trestle. They found Vane's graders on the far side of Painted Mesa. The massive, horse-drawn machines were carving a raw, red wound across the land, leveling a path for a future spur line. The air was filled with the groaning of wood, the jangle of harness, and the shouts of men who believed themselves to be utterly alone. From the shade of a dense cluster of mesquite 100 yards away, Tessa worked. She set her camera, her movements now as quiet and practiced as Gideon's. She captured the graders, the straining teams of horses, the raw, ugly scar they left on the earth. Each click of her shutter felt like a small act of rebellion. Gideon stood watch, his back to her, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He was a statue carved from vigilance, his presence a silent promise of protection. He trusted her to do her work. She trusted him to keep her safe while she did it. It was a partnership forged in whispers and necessity. Late in the afternoon of the second day, their patience was rewarded. They were positioned above a series of deep, clear pools, part of an upstream tributary that fed the Silver Thread Wash. These pools were a lifeline, a gathering place for the deer and antelope that still survived in the arid landscape. 2 riders appeared, Barlow Crick and one of his deputies. They weren't grading. They were carrying heavy burlap sacks, slung over their saddles. They dismounted, their movements furtive, their heads constantly turning to scan the empty landscape. They were certain they were unobserved. "Now," Gideon whispered, his breath warm against Tessa's ear. Tessa was already moving. She had the camera ready, the plate sensitized. She disappeared under the black cloth, the world turning upside down. In her focused, inverted reality, she saw Crick haul a heavy sack to the edge of the highest pool. He untied the top, and with a grunt of effort, heaved it. A cascade of coarse, white powder poured into the pristine water. Salt. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. It was a slow, deliberate act of poison, a trick Vane would deny later, blaming the drought, the natural alkalinity of the soil, anything but his own hand. She watched as he and his man moved down the line, fouling each pool, turning the clear water into a sterile, undrinkable brine. She worked with a cold, precise fury. She uncapped the lens. She counted the seconds, her mind a perfect, cold clock. She captured Crick, his face clearly visible, emptying the last sack. She captured the white, cloudy poison spreading through the clear water. She slid a new plate in, capturing the dead silence of the aftermath. the glistening salt crystals already crusting on the rocks. She had it. This was the loud proof. This was the image that would hang them. She was just pulling the plate holder from the camera when Gideon's hand clamped down on her shoulder. "Move! Now! Quietly!" His voice was a low, urgent hiss. She didn't question it. She grabbed her gear, and they melted back into the shadows of the canyon wall, pulling the mule with them. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart starting to pound. "Mallory." Gideon breathed. "He's circling back. He must have seen something." They heard him before they saw him. The slow, deliberate clop of a single horse, its iron shoes striking sparks from the rock. He was coming up the same game trail they had used. There was nowhere to run. "Here," Gideon said, his voice a blade. He shoved her, hard, into a deep, narrow fissure in the red rock, a crack in the stone barely wide enough for two people to stand. He pressed in behind her, his body a solid wall against her back. The space was so tight. She was pinned between the rough, cold stone in front of her and the hard, warm reality of him behind her. Mallory was getting closer. They could hear the creak of his saddle leather. Gideon's hand came up, not rough this time, but firm, and covered her mouth. It was a gesture of absolute silence. His calloused palm was dry and smelled of leather and dust. He leaned in, his mouth so close to her ear she could feel the words more than hear them. "Don't breathe." She froze, her body rigid. Through the narrow opening of the fissure, she could see a sliver of the world outside. Mallory appeared, his horse ambling slowly, his head turning, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. He was a predator, sensing something amiss. He stopped, not 20 feet from them. Tessa's world shrank to the space of that tiny crack in the rock, the rough texture of the sandstone against her cheek, the solid, unyielding pressure of Gideon's body against her back, the weight of his hand over her mouth. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through his chest, a counterpoint to the frantic drumming of her own. 2 breaths, held in unison. 2 heartbeats, trying to find one rhythm. Her satchel, slung over her shoulder, was wedged awkwardly between her and the rock. The pressure was immense, with a sickening sharp crack, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the silent canyon. One of the glass plates inside shattered. Tessa's body went rigid. A cry, a small gasp of pure terror, rose in her throat. Gideon's hand tightened, his fingers pressing into her cheek, smothering the sound before it could be born. Outside, Mallory's horse whinnied, its ears pricked. Mallory reined it in, his own body tense. He stared directly at the fissure, at the deep shadow where they were hidden. For a long, agonizing moment, the world held its breath. Tessa was sure he could see them, that he could hear the frantic pounding of her heart. Then, a hawk cried out, a high, piercing shriek from the sky above. Mallory's gaze lifted. He scanned the sky, then the far ridge. He seemed to decide the sound had come from the hawk, or an echo, or his own imagination. With a final, lingering look at the shadows, he nudged his horse with his heels and continued down the trail. They waited until the sound of his horse had completely faded, until there was nothing but the whisper of the wind. Even then, Gideon didn't move. He kept them pressed into the rock, his hand over her mouth, listening. Finally, he relaxed. He took his hand away, and the sudden coolness on her skin was a shock. He stepped back, giving her room to breathe. Tessa sagged against the rock, her knees weak. Her first thought was of the plate. She fumbled with the clasp of her satchel. Inside, amidst the carefully slotted plates, were the glittering, sharp fragments of one, the one she had taken of Gideon's back, the one that felt personal. She swallowed a cry of loss. "Leave it." Gideon's voice was a low whisper beside her. He was looking at her, his eyes dark with a grim intensity. "It's just glass. Keep the ones that hang men." His words were like a splash of cold water. He was right. She took a deep, shuddering breath, nodded, and closed the satchel. The broken plate was a sacrifice, a necessary loss. They waited until dusk, until the shadows were long and the world was painted in shades of purple and orange. Before they moved again, they led their animals through the twilight, their narrow escape having stripped away any pretense of casualness. They were partners now, bound by a shared, mortal danger. As they crested a small, barren ridge, a smell reached them, the sour, acrid stench of old smoke and ash. Below them, nestled in a small, sheltered valley, was a homestead, or what was left of it. It was a ruin. The small adobe house was a blackened shell, its roof gone, its windows empty, sightless eyes staring at the sky. The barn had been burned to its foundation. The corrals were empty, the fences torn down. "The De Leons," Gideon said, his voice a hollow whisper. He dismounted and walked down the slope, his movements stiff. Tessa followed, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The silence was the worst part. There were no chickens scratching in the dirt, no dog barking a welcome, no lowing of cattle. There was only the sound of the wind sighing through the charred ruins. The De Leon family, a brother and sister, both adults, quiet folk who kept to themselves, had been trying to make a life here. Now, there was nothing. Their small herd of cattle was gone. And the well, the heart of the homestead, had been fouled. A thick, greasy scum floated on the surface of the water, and the stench of decay rose from its depths. Someone had dumped a dead animal into it. Tessa's jaw began to tremble, an uncontrollable tremor of rage and grief. This wasn't about eminent domain or legal papers. This was scorched earth. This was cruelty for its own sake. An act designed not just to drive people out, but to break their spirits, to ensure they could never come back. Gideon stood by the fouled well, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of silence, of not getting involved, of keeping his head down. But the ruin of the De Leon place broke through his walls. It was a violation so profound it demanded a voice. He spoke, not to Tessa, but to the ashes, to the poisoned well, to the empty sky. His voice was low, rough, and shaking with a fury that was terrifying in its stillness. It was a vow. "No more," he said. "By God, no more." They rode back to the line shack in a heavy, somber silence. The small, claustrophobic room felt like a sanctuary. That night, under the familiar, hellish glow of the ruby lantern, Tessa unpacked her camera. Gideon was sitting on the cot, cleaning his rifle, his movements mechanical. He looked up as she set up her tripod. "What are you doing?" "I'm taking a picture," she said. She looked at him, at the ladder of old scars visible through the tear in his shirt from their scramble. "Of your scar." He stiffened, his hands stilling on the rifle. "Why?" "Because," she said, her voice soft. "It's a map of where you've been. Because it's a truth that Vane can't poison or burn. Because you need to let someone see it." He looked at her, his eyes shadowed in the red light. He was a man who had never willingly shown a weakness, who had hidden his wounds from the world. She was asking to see him, truly see him, and to capture that vulnerability on glass. It was an act of profound intimacy, more revealing than any touch. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He unbuttoned his shirt, not taking it off, but pulling it aside, exposing the brutal, laddered scars on his ribs. He turned slightly, offering the wound to her lens. He let her. Intimacy is permission. She disappeared under the cloth. She focused the lens, not on his face, but on the puckered, white landscape of his skin. The click of the shutter was a soft, respectful sound in the quiet room. When she emerged, he was still sitting there, his shirt still open. He was looking at her, his guard completely down for the first time. The silence was no longer awkward or tense. It was full, humming with everything they weren't saying. She took a step toward him. He didn't move. She took another. She reached out, her fingers hesitating an inch from his skin, and traced the path of the highest scar. A light, feather-like touch. He didn't flinch. He just watched her, his breath catching in his throat. He leaned in. She leaned in. Their faces were inches apart. The air was thick, electric. He was going to kiss her. She was going to let him. It was inevitable. A conclusion written in the shared danger and the sudden, shocking tenderness of this moment. But just before their lips met, she stopped them. She raised a single fingertip and pressed it gently to his mouth. "Not yet," she whispered. Her voice was steady, but her heart was a wild thing in her chest. "Not until we're safe enough to name it." His eyes searched hers, full of a raw, questioning vulnerability. He pulled back slightly, his voice a rough whisper. "I forgot what naming felt like." A sad, gentle smile touched her lips. She let her hand cup his jaw, her thumb stroking the rough stubble. "It feels like yours," she said. The unspoken promise, the kiss that waited, was more powerful than any kiss could have been. It was a covenant, a reason to fight, a reason to survive. They talked then, their voices low. The planning a necessary anchor in the swirling emotional currents. "There's a judge," Gideon said, his voice regaining some of its usual gruffness. "In Santa Fe, Ella Jericho. They say she can't be bought. They say she's honest." "Santa Fe," Tessa breathed. "That's 100 miles from here." "It's the only chance we have." He said, "We take your plates. We ride hard. We tell her everything." It was a desperate plan, but it was a plan. It was hope. But as dawn broke the next morning, that hope seemed to shrink. Gideon, scouting from the highest ridge of his property, came back with a grim expression. "Mallory's put men on the ridge lines," he said. "2 of them, watching the passes, the main road to Coyote's Gate, and the trail north. They're not letting anyone in or out." The vice was closing. They were trapped. That afternoon, while they waited, watching the distant figures on the ridges, their enforced stillness became a new kind of classroom. Gideon, seeing the need for a language that could pass between them at a distance, began to teach her a silent system of hand signals he'd learned from the Apache. A flat palm held out meant wait. A fist, tapped over the heart, meant danger. A hand, circling in the air, meant come to me. In return, she taught him her own language, the language of light and time. She explained how to count the seconds for a perfect exposure in the flat morning light versus the golden light of dusk. She showed him how the angle of the sun could reveal details the naked eye would miss. He would signal danger from across the corral, and she would signal back, her fingers counting out 5 seconds in the air. He taught her how to survive in a world of silence. She taught him how to see the truth in a world of light. Their bodies, their minds, began to learn the same grammar. They were becoming a single, cohesive unit. 2 loners learning to move as one, preparing for a fight they had no choice but to win. They rode before the sky had even decided on a color, moving through a landscape of gray shadow and cold mist. Gideon had found a flaw in Mallory's net, a narrow goat trail that wound down the face of the mesa, a path so treacherous it was left unguarded. It was a calculated risk, one that had them leading the horses and mules single file, their boots dislodging pebbles that rattled into the darkness below. By the time the first flat yellow light of dawn hit the valley floor, they were on the main road, just 2 more travelers approaching the town of Coyote's Gate. The town was dying. It announced itself with a sign that hung by a single leather hinge. Its painted letters, "Welcome to Coyote's Gate, Pup, 412, flaked and peeling, the sign itself swinging in a slow, mournful arc with every gust of wind. The church bell, which should have been ringing for morning prayers, was silent. As they passed, a gust of wind clapped the iron tongue against the brass, and the sound was dull, a hollow thud of dust. Main Street was a wide, rutted expanse of dirt, lined with false-fronted buildings that slumped in on themselves, The only new paint in town was on the posters plastered over every available surface, the saloon windows, the door of the assay office, the town message board. They all bore the same arrogant eagle and the same bold letters, Silas Vane. Progress needs your thirst. Progress, Tessa muttered, her voice a low, venomous thing. He's calling it progress. They reached the central square, a dusty plaza with a dry well at its center. Tessa pulled her wagon, the newly repaired wheel turning smoothly, into the middle of the square. Gideon reined in beside her. He looked not at her, but at the courthouse at the far end of the plaza. It was a squat, solid building of new brick, the only structure in town that looked permanent, and on its door was a heavy, new padlock. Vane's, Gideon said, his voice flat. He nodded toward the livery stable at the opposite end of the street. I'll see to the animals. You do what you came to do. He didn't wait for a reply. He peeled away, leading his horse and her mule, Jezebel, toward the stable, his movements quiet and deliberate, a shadow detaching itself. Tessa was left alone in the center of the square with her wagon, her cameras, and her box of glass plates. She didn't have to wait long. Her arrival, a strange woman with a photographer's wagon, had not gone unnoticed. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. A few men, miners and ranchers with suspicion carved into their faces, emerged from the saloon. A shopkeeper swept his boardwalk, his broom strokes slowing, his eyes on her. The town was holding its breath. Then, a new figure emerged, not from the saloon or a shop, but from the small, clean office of the territorial magistrate. It was a woman, and she moved with a purpose that scattered the dust at her feet. She was tall, dressed in a severe black frock that was practical, not fashionable. Her graying hair pulled back in a tight, uncompromising bun. Her eyes were the color of steel, and they missed nothing. She carried no gavel, no law book. She carried only a branding iron, one with a simple J for a head. This was Judge Ella Jericho. The rumor was she'd been a mule skinner before her husband, a circuit judge, had died and left her his books. She had read them all, passed the bar in Santa Fe, and returned to dispense a kind of law this territory had never seen one that was honest. She walked directly to Tessa in the wagon. The gathering crowd, now numbering a dozen, followed, keeping a respectful distance. "You're the photographer," Judge Jericho stated. It wasn't a question. "I am," Tessa said, her voice clear. "Tessa Lockhart. I'm here to file a complaint against Silas Vane." A collective, anxious murmur rose from the crowd. Naming Vane out loud was a blasphemy. "The courthouse is closed," Judge Jericho said, her gaze flicking to the padlock, her lip curling in disdain. "Mr. Vane, in his capacity as head of the Town Improvement Committee, has declared it unsafe, convenient." She slammed the blunt end of the branding iron onto the dry-rotted rim of the town well. The thump was loud and final. "This court," she announced, her voice carrying across the entire plaza, "is now in session, right here, in the dirt, where the truth belongs." It was a spectacle. She was convening a field hearing in the middle of Main Street. The crowd pressed closer, their fear momentarily eclipsed by their desperate, hungry curiosity. "State your claim, Miss Lockhart." Tessa's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She pulled her father's oilskin-wrapped survey from her satchel. "I present this survey, dated 1879 by Arthur James Lockhart. It proves the Silver Thread Wash is a perennial stream, not seasonal." She then retrieved the surveyor's pin she had dug up. "And I present this pin, which I found on Gideon Rourke's land yesterday, miles off the legal line. It bears a forgery of my father's seal. It is the basis for Mr. Vane's fraudulent eminent domain claim." Judge Jericho took the pin, her eyebrows climbing as she inspected the brass cap. "Survey chain lengths are a matter of territorial code, Miss Lockhart. A forged survey is a federal crime." She looked out at the crowd. It appears Mr. Vane is not just thirsty. He's a thief. This is an outrage, a circus. The voice was smooth, polished, and full of indignation. A gleaming black phaeton, pulled by a matched pair of gray horses, rolled into the square. Silas Vane stepped down. Not a speck of dust on his polished black boots or his fine wool suit. He was handsome, his silver hair immaculate, his smile a weapon. Flint Mallory was a step behind him, a dark, watchful shadow. "Judge Jericho," Vane said, his tone one of reasonable patience. "You cannot convene a court in a public street. This is a mockery of the law." "The law, Mr. Vane," Ella shot back, "is not in the brick. It is in the charter. And the charter says I will hear the grievances of the people. I'm hearing one now." Vane chuckled, a sound meant to dismiss. "A grievance from a transient photographer. My dear woman," he said, turning his smile on Tessa. "That wash has been dry for 3 seasons. My reservoir is a matter of public good, of progress. The eminent domain stands. Your father's old papers are just that, old, mistaken." "He's a liar," Tessa said, her voice shaking with rage. "Proof, Miss Lockhart," Ella said, her steel eyes on Tessa. "You're making a claim. Back it." "She has no proof," Mallory interjected, his voice smooth as oiled steel. He stepped forward, pulling a familiar object from his coat pocket, the glass plate. "This is the kind of proof she deals in." He held it up for the judge to see. It was the plate he had taken from the shack, the silhouette of Gideon against the rainy window. "It's art, Judge," Mallory said, his smile thin, moody, experimental. "She's an artist, a hobbyist, not a surveyor. She's trespassing on railroad property, taking pictures of ranch hands." The crowd murmured. Vane had bought the judge. Mallory was painting her as a fanatic, a lonely woman with a camera. Tessa felt a hot flush of humiliation. Judge Jericho studied the plate. She looked at the stark, lonely image. Then she looked back at Mallory, her expression unreadable. "An interesting composition. Mr. Mallory? But you've made her case for her." Mallory's smile faltered. "If she is a photographer," Ella continued, her voice cutting through the quiet, "then she does not have just one plate. She has a box of them. I want to see all of them. Miss Lockhart, present your evidence." This was it, the moment. Vane's face tightened. "Judge, this is irregular." "Silence," Ella commanded, "or I'll have you cited for contempt of this well." Tessa's heart was a hammer against her ribs. She moved to the back of her wagon and unlatched the heavy, slotted box that held her work. She pulled out the plates from Painted Mesa. "I present this plate," she said, her voice ringing out, "showing Mr. Vane's graders illegally carving a spur line across land not their own." She held it up. The crowd surged forward to see the image, a raw scar on the land. "And this one," she said, her hand steady now, "showing the homestead of the De Leon family, burned to the ground, their well fouled." A gasp went through the crowd. The De Leons were known quiet folk. "Vane, you monster!" a woman shouted from the back. "And finally," Tessa said, her voice dropping, "I present this, taken 2 days ago, at the upstream pools." She held up the final plate. The image was undeniable. Barlow Crick, his face clear, caught in the act of emptying a sack of salt into the clear water, the cloudy poison spreading. A terrible, collective sound bruised the air. It was a gasp, a groan, a sound of profound, communal betrayal. These people had been told Vane was bringing them water, and here was proof he was poisoning what little they had left. Silas Vane's polished mask shattered. His face went white, then a deep, mottled red. "This is a fabrication, a trick of the light lies." "The light, Mr. Vane, does not lie," Judge Jericho said, her voice cold as ice. "People do." She looked at the plate, then at Vane. "This is a damnable act. I am ordering a full, armed inspection of the sites. I'm commissioning a territorial marshal escort. We will ride to those pools. We will ride to that forged pin. We will ride today." "You cannot," Vane shouted, his composure gone. "I have a federal charter. I will not be harassed by this street theater." "This theater is now a court of inquiry," Ella roared. She raised the branding iron high and brought it down on the well rim with all her strength. The clang of iron on wood echoed through the square. A gavel of pure, Western justice. "This court stands in recess until this inspection is fire." The scream cut through her words. It came from the far end of the street. A man was pointing, his face a mask of terror. "The livery! It's on fire!" Tessa spun around. Thick, greasy. Black smoke was pouring from the livery stable, billowing into the clear blue sky. As they watched, a tongue of orange flame licked up the side of the building, tasting the dry wood. Chaos erupted. The crowd, a moment ago a single focused body of justice, shattered into 100 panicking individuals. Men shouted, women screamed, the horses tied to the hitching posts, smelling the smoke, began to rear and pull, their high-pitched whinnies of terror cutting through the din. "My God," Tessa breathed, her first thought leaping to the animals. "Jezebel! Gideon!" Vane and Mallory were already moving, using the chaos as cover, backing toward their phaeton. "This is what anarchy brings, Judge." Vane shouted, "You've incited a riot." "Gideon!" Tessa cried out, running toward the smoke. She didn't get 10 feet before a wall of black smoke rolled down the street, engulfing everything. She choked, her eyes streaming. The heat was immense. She heard a terrible screaming from inside the stable, the sound of trapped horses. "Tessa," his voice came from the smoke. A low, urgent command. A hand grabbed her arm. "Gideon!" His face was grim. His eyes narrowed against the smoke. He was holding a wet bandana over his mouth. "The horses," she coughed, pulling against his grip. "It's too late for most of them." He yelled over the roar of the flames. "The fire started in the hayloft. Someone said it went up like a torch." The screaming of the horses was a sound she would never forget. "We have to try." He saw the look on her face, the same unbending stubbornness. He didn't argue. He just held her arm tighter. "This way, back door." He pulled her through the alley, into the corral behind the burning building. A single mare, her flanks scorched and her mane on fire, had managed to kick her way out of a stall. She was trapped in the corral, rearing and blind with panic, crashing into the fences. "Open the gate!" Gideon yelled. Tessa ran to the gate, her hands fumbling with the heavy wooden latch. Gideon, without hesitation, grabbed a horse blanket from a rail, dunked it in the water trough, and walked straight toward the panicked, burning animal. He moved with the same preternatural calm she had seen him use on the Mustang, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "Easy, girl. Easy now. I've got you." He threw the wet blanket over the mare's head, smothering the flames on her mane, and grabbed her halter. He led the trembling, smoking animal toward the gate Tessa had just thrown open. They guided the mare out into the street, away from the blaze, just as the main roof of the livery caved in with a deafening roar, sending a column of sparks and embers high into the air. The crowd fell back, shielding their faces. Tessa was shaking, her lungs aching, her heart broken by the sound of the animals that hadn't made it. She was covered in soot, her dress singed. Gideon stood beside her, his face black with ash. He looked at her, his eyes checking her for injury. He saw her trembling. In the middle of the chaos, with the town shouting and the fire roaring, he acted. It wasn't a thought. It was an instinct. He stripped off his heavy duster, the one that smelled of smoke and horse and him, and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her close, shielding her body with his own as a fresh shower of embers rained down. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, her face streaked with tears and soot. He looked down at her. The world had dissolved into smoke and fire and the sound of his own heart. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the kiss that had waited in the line shack. There was no tenderness, no time for a slow unfolding. It was a brutal, desperate claiming. It was fast and hard, and tasted of ash and smoke and fear and the sudden, shocking realization of what they stood to lose. It was a promise cashed in small, a desperate assertion of life in the face of destruction. He broke it as quickly as it began, pushing her back a step. "Stay here! Stay safe!" he commanded, his voice rough. Before she could answer, Judge Ella Jericho was there, her face grim, the branding iron in her hand. She was flanked by 2 armed men who looked like they'd just been deputized. "This was no accident," Ella said, her voice loud enough to be heard over the crackle of the fire. "It was a distraction, Vane's work, or someone who panicked. It doesn't matter." She looked at the burning building, then at the shocked faces of the townsfolk, then at Tessa, who was clutching Gideon's duster around her. "This hearing is recessed," she announced, her voice the only point of order in the chaos. "The inspection is postponed until first light. I want armed guards on Miss Lockhart, on her wagon, and on Mr. Rourke. We will ride at dawn." She turned, her gaze finding both Vane, who was standing by his carriage with a look of feigned horror, and Tessa, who stood beside Gideon in the smoke. "And I warn you all," Ella cried, her voice a blade. "Both sides. You come to me tomorrow with truth, or you come with silence, because the next person who lies in my court will be spending the winter in the Santa Fe jail. So help me God." The dawn inspection party rode out from Coyote's Gate under a sky of pale, washed-out blue. The air was deceptively clean, scrubbed by the previous day's fire and carrying the faint, lingering scent of wet ash. Judge Ella Jericho led the way, sitting ramrod straight on a sturdy buckskin, the long barrel of a shotgun resting easy across her lap. She was flanked by 2 grim-faced men she had deputized on the spot, their new tin stars looking alien on their dusty vests. Tessa rode her mule, Jezebel, her precious box of plates strapped securely behind her saddle. Gideon was beside her, mounted on a rangy roan, his rifle in its scabbard but his eyes constantly moving, scanning the high ridges, the deep shadows, the places where a man could hide. They were a small, tight knot of purpose, an island of law in a lawless land. Behind them rode Flint Mallory and 2 of Vane's men, a necessary but unwelcome part of the escort. Mallory was a picture of bored professionalism, as if this was all a tedious formality. He rode with a loose rein, his gaze placid, but Gideon watched the way his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every rock, every turn in the trail. "My scouts will range ahead," Mallory announced as they approached the mouth of the Silver Thread Narrows, his voice casual. "Ensure the path is clear. Can't be too careful." Judge Jericho gave a curt nod. "See that you do, Mr. Mallory." Mallory and his men peeled off, taking a high trail that led up to the rimrock, their figures quickly shrinking against the sky. Gideon's hand, which had been resting on his thigh, moved to settle on the stock of his rifle. "He's not scouting," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for Tessa. "He's taking his position." Tessa's hand instinctively went to the leather satchel carrying her camera case. Inside, wrapped in flannel, were the glass plates that were either their salvation or their death warrant. "I know," she whispered. They entered the Narrows. The canyon walls rose up on either side, sheer cliffs of red rock that squeezed the sky into a thin, bright ribbon above them. The temperature dropped. The air grew still. The sound of their horses' hooves on the rocky ground was unnervingly loud, echoing off the stone. It was a natural trap. Every instinct in Tessa's body screamed at her. They were walking into the barrel of a gun. "The world exploded!" The sound was not a bang. It was a physical crack that split the air, the universe. A puff of white smoke bloomed high on the canyon rim. A deadly, beautiful flower. One of the new deputies, the one on Ella's right, grunted, a soft, surprised sound, and slumped forward in his saddle, a dark stain spreading across the back of his shirt. His horse, panicked, reared and bolted, and the man slid from the saddle like a sack of grain, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The echo of the first shot was still bouncing off the walls when the second and third followed. The other deputy cried out, clutching his shoulder. Judge Jericho's shotgun roared, a deafening blast of buckshot that she fired blindly toward the rimrock, more an act of defiance than a targeted shot. Chaos! Horses screamed, spinning in the narrow confines. The air was suddenly thick with the acrid smell of black powder. Ambush. Gideon didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning. He launched himself from his saddle, grabbing the front of Tessa's shirt and yanking her from her own mount in a single, brutal motion. They hit the ground together, the impact driving the air from her lungs. "Stay down," he roared, shoving her toward a low lip of shale that offered the barest sliver of cover. He scrambled for the rifle that had fallen from the dead deputy's hand, a long-barreled Winchester. He pushed her head down behind the rock, his body shielding hers. He worked the lever on the rifle, chambering a round. He rose, just his head and shoulders exposed, a lifetime of hunting distilled into one deadly, efficient movement. He was not a soldier returning fire wildly. He was a hunter, his actions measured, not heroic. His eyes found a flicker of movement on the ridge, a glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. He raised the Winchester, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. High above, a man cried out, a thin, sharp sound that was cut short. He disappeared from the ridge. Gideon worked the lever again. Another shot bloomed from the rocks to their left. He didn't even seem to aim. He simply turned, fired, and a second cry echoed in the canyon. 2 shots. 2 men who would never again see the sun set. Tessa, her heart hammering against the rock, saw the fallen deputy's rifle lying in the open, 10 feet away. It was another weapon, another chance. Gideon was reloading. Without thinking, she kicked out with her boot, sending the rifle skittering across the dusty ground toward him. He scooped it up, his eyes never leaving the canyon rim, and gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement. She kept her camera case clutched to her chest like it was her own heart. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. Flint Mallory was standing there, having used the gunfire as cover to scramble down the scree slope. His face was a calm, predatory mask. He wasn't interested in the gunfight. He was interested in her. He lunged, not for her, but for the camera case. She twisted away, and his hand clamped down on her wrist like a manacle of iron. His grip was cold, strong, and utterly without passion. "The plates, Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice a low, conversational rasp. "The judge is a sentimental woman. I am not." Gideon saw it. He was 50 feet away, pinned by a third rifleman. He couldn't get a clear shot. He roared Tessa's name, a sound of pure, primal fury. He dropped the rifle, he drew the heavy skinning knife from the sheath on his belt, and he charged. It was not the movement of a man. It was the movement of weather, a storm front, a flash flood, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or stopped. He covered the ground in a blur of motion, his boots kicking up dust, his eyes locked on Mallory. Mallory saw him coming. He let go of Tessa, raising his own rifle to use as a club. He was bigger than Gideon, heavier, but Gideon had the momentum, the rage. He didn't try to go around the rifle. He went under it. He crashed into Mallory, the impact driving both men back, knife to rifle. They were tangled, chest to chest, a desperate, ugly, silent struggle. Mallory brought the butt of his rifle down, aiming for Gideon's skull. Gideon twisted, the blow glancing off his shoulder. Mallory's knee came up. driving into Gideon's gut. Gideon grunted, but his left hand shot out, grabbing Mallory's throat, his thumb digging for the artery. They were as close as breath, a dance of death in the dust and gun smoke. Tessa, scrambling back, saw her opening. Mallory's head was turned, his entire focus on the silent, deadly man in his arms. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she launched herself forward, lowering her head, and drove the crown of her skull directly into the bridge of Mallory's nose. There was a wet, sickening crunch. Mallory bellowed, a sound of pure agony and shock. His head snapped back. His grip on Gideon loosened. He staggered back, his hands flying to his face, blood pouring between his fingers. In that one chaotic moment, the leather satchel was knocked from Tessa's shoulder. It hit the ground, and the sound of shattering glass tore through the air. But as the satchel fell open, one plate, wrapped in its flannel cloth, slid out. It skittered across the rock, spinning like a tossed coin, and came to rest, miraculously unharmed. Inches from the edge of a deep fissure, it was the plate of the surveyor's pin, Gideon's boot standing guard beside it. The sky chose that moment to break its silence. A low, ominous rumble of thunder rolled through the canyon. The light began to fail, the blue sky turning a bruised, sickly gray in a matter of seconds. Mallory, his face a mask of blood, was recovering. He lowered his hands, his eyes blazing with a murderous rage, and raised his rifle again. Then the world turned white. The first hailstones hit, not as ice, but as rocks. They were the size of hen's eggs, striking the ground with the force of thrown stones, hammering the canyon walls, kicking up plumes of dust. The sky's temper was on their side. The riflemen on the ridge, exposed and unprotected, cried out as the barrage hit them. The hailstorm was a deafening, indiscriminate roar. It was impossible to see, impossible to aim. "The cave!" Gideon yelled, his voice barely audible over the din. He grabbed Tessa's arm with one hand and snatched the surviving glass plate from the ground with the other. He dragged her toward a dark slash in the canyon wall she hadn't even noticed, a narrow fissure carved into the rock by a million years of flash floods. It was a storm-split cave. They scrambled inside, Mallory forgotten, the world outside dissolving into a roaring, percussive chaos. They stumbled deep into the fissure, into a darkness that was absolute. The roar of the hailstorm was muffled now, a deep, humming drumbeat that vibrated through the stone around them. Inside, there was only darkness, utter and complete. Tessa couldn't see Gideon, couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. There was only the sound of their own ragged, desperate breathing, and the storm. She reached out, her hands trembling, into the blackness, not to find him, but just to find something solid. Her fingers brushed against the rough wool of his shirt. His hands found hers, lacing his fingers through hers. His grip was sure, steady. They stood like that for a long moment, anchored to each other in the roaring dark. Then, slowly, her free hand came up. She found his shoulder, his neck, his jaw. Her fingers traced the rough stubble, the hard line of his bone. It was a question asked in the dark. "Are you real? Are you still here?" His other hand came up, cupping her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't even realized she'd shed. He said her name. Just once. "Tessa." It wasn't a shout or a command. It was like the sound of water in a dry land, a discovery. He leaned down, and she rose up, and they kissed. It was slow and sure and deep. It held the terror of the ambush, the fury of the fight, and the profound, aching relief of survival. It was a kiss that had waited, and it was worth the wait. In the sheltering dark, with the storm drumming a wild rhythm on the rock outside, they held each other, their hands learning what their hearts already knew. It was a shared warmth, a whispered, unspoken consent. It was a silent vow, made in the heart of the stone, that they would walk out of this place together, or not at all. The world outside ceased to exist, and there was only the dark, and their breath, and the promise. The hail faded to rain, and the rain to a steady, quiet drip. The dawn that followed was a hush. A soft, gray light seeped into the mouth of the cave, revealing a world washed clean. The air smelled of wet stone and rain. They emerged, not together, but one after the other. Their clothes were dusted with red sand, their faces smudged with grime, but their eyes were new. The fear and the desperation had been burned away, leaving behind a clear, quiet certainty. A deep, unshakable respect sat easy on their shoulders. They were no longer a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were partners, survivors. They stood at the mouth of the cave, looking out at the transformed canyon. The bodies of the ambushers were gone. Mallory was gone. The only signs of the battle were the dead marshals, covered now with saddle blankets, and the churned-up earth. Then, Gideon tensed. "Riders," he said, his hand going to his knife. On the high ridge, where Mallory's men had been, a line of horsemen appeared, silhouetted against the morning sky. For a heart-stopping moment, Tessa thought Vane had sent a second wave. But as the riders came closer, she saw the determined figure at their head. It was Judge Ella Jericho, her shotgun held across her saddle. She was leading 5 men, her face set like granite. "We were delayed," Ella called out as they reached the canyon floor, her voice hoarse. "Vane had men at the old bridge, a second ambush. We fought our own skirmish to get here." She looked from Gideon to Tessa, at their exhausted faces, at the single precious glass plate in Gideon's hand. She looked at the bodies of her fallen deputies, her steel-gray eyes filled with a cold, hard fire. "It seems," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "that Mr. Vane has just declared war on the territory of New Mexico." Judge Ella Jericho's face was carved from granite as she stared at the single, miraculous glass plate in Gideon's hand. The gray morning light was unforgiving, illuminating the image with cold, hard clarity. The freshly pounded surveyor's pin, the forged brass cap, Gideon's boots standing beside it for scale. It was a perfect, irrefutable photograph of a crime. "He murdered 2 of my men for this," Ella said, her voice a low, vibrating engine of fury. She looked at the bodies of her deputies, wrapped in their saddle blankets. "He murdered them to stop this piece of glass." She turned to Gideon and Tessa. The fight in the Narrows, the shared terror in the cave, had changed them. They stood together, not as 2 individuals, but as a single unit, their movements and glances aligned. "This is no longer a civil complaint," Ella declared, her voice ringing in the canyon. "This is a criminal conspiracy. We are done reacting. We are now the hunt." She looked at her 3 remaining, shaken posse members. "Get our men, take them back to town, gently. Tell the undertaker this is on Vane's account." To one man, she said, "You, ride to the poisoned pools. See if Crick or his men returned. But do not engage. Report." The man nodded, his face pale, and spurred his horse. "Judge, wait," Tessa said. "Crick is Vane's foreman. He won't be at the pools. He'll be at the trestle, or the ledger house, the paper trail." Ella looked at Tessa, then at Gideon. "You're right. The paper trail. The trestle office is where they run the payroll and operations. That's where we'll find the records." She pointed the barrel of her shotgun at Gideon. "Gideon Rourke, I am formally deputizing you in the name of the New Mexico Territory. You will act with my authority. You too," she said to her remaining men, "will come with me. We are seizing the trestle office records. Now." "And us?" Gideon asked, his hand instinctively resting on the knife at his belt. "You," Ella said, her steel-gray eyes locking on Tessa. "Are the weapons—" "You go to the ledger house. Vane keeps his land agent there, a man named Finch. He sweats ink and fears Vane more than God. He's the one who keeps the real books, the ones that prove the fraud." She looked at them both. "You have the plate of the pin. Go get me the plate of the books. Do not fail. They split, Ella and her men riding hard toward the railroad trestle, a direct assault on Vane's operations. Gideon and Tessa took the low road, back toward the sleeping, wounded town of Coyote's Gate. They rode as co-conspirators, united by a purpose that had been forged in gunfire and hail. The Ledger House was a narrow, two-story building smelling of dust, stale ink, and fear. The man inside, Mr. Finch, was exactly as Ella had described. He was a small, pale man in a stained shirt, with spectacles perched on a nose that seemed to be sweating. When Tessa and Gideon walked in, Gideon's hand resting on the butt of his pistol, Finch shot to his feet, knocking over his inkwell. A black stain spread across his desk. "Mr. Rourke, I wasn't expecting—" "We're not here to be expected. Finch," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. He moved to block the door. "We're here on behalf of Judge Jericho. We're here for the real plats." "Plats? The plats are all public record." "At the courthouse," Finch stammered, his hands fluttering like trapped birds as he tried to blot the ink spill. "The ones at the courthouse are Vane's story," Tessa said, her voice sharp and clear. She moved past him, her eyes scanning the office. It was filled with rolled maps, dusty deed books, and towering stacks of paper. "We want the truth. We want the adjusted set, the ones you keep in the floor safe." Finch went chalk white. I don't know what you're talking about." Gideon took one step toward him. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the man, his eyes cold with the memory of the ambush, of the dead deputies. Finch crumbled. He physically shrank, his shoulders slumping. "He'll ruin me," Finch whispered, his eyes darting to the floor. "He'll hang," Gideon countered. "And you'll be right beside him if you don't open it. Now." With a trembling hand, Finch knelt, rolled back a threadbare rug, and worked the combination on a small iron safe set into the floorboards. He pulled out a single, long, leather-bound tube. Tessa took it from him. She unrolled the map on the ink-stained desk. It was a plat of the entire valley, from Coyote's Gate to the Silver Thread Wash, and beside it, Finch had made his notes, his precise, terrified handwriting detailing the real land parcels. "Look," Tessa breathed, her finger tracing a line. "Here's the public filing." She pointed to a section of the map where the wash was marked seasonal. "And here," she pointed to a nearly identical, smaller map, tucked into the same tube, "is the adjusted one, the one for Vane's investors." On this second map, the wash was clearly marked perennial, but the most damning evidence was the date. It was dated a full year before her father's survey, a blatant attempt to predate his claim. Tessa leaned closer, her photographer's eyes seeing the detail others would miss. "He shaved it," she whispered in furious awe. "The date, it was 1883. He used a penknife to shave the 3 into a 0, 1880. He faked the date." "It's his word against ours," Gideon said, his jaw tight. "A clerical error. He'll call it." "Not when I'm done," Tessa said. A fierce, predatory light was in her eyes. This was her battlefield. She turned to Finch, who was watching them, his face slick with sweat. "I need a wash tub, and hot water, now!" A wash tub? "Do it," Gideon commanded. Finch scrambled out of the office and up the stairs to the boarding room above. While he was gone, Tessa unpacked her camera and her chemical boxes. She was turning the office into a dark room. When Finch returned with a tin wash tub, Tessa was already coating a new plate with collodion. She set the camera on its tripod, aimed it directly at the 2 maps lying side by side on the desk. She framed the forged date, the conflicting water labels. She put her own father's survey beside them for comparison. She uncapped the lens, the click of the shutter echoing in the small, silent room. "You can't do that," Finch yelped. "That's private property." "It's evidence," Tessa said, her voice hard. She took the exposed plate and began the process, Not in the safety of a dark room, but right there, in a borrowed wash tub. With the door wide open, she worked with a speed and precision that was dazzling. She poured the developer, the image blooming into existence. She fixed it, washing it in the tin tub. Immediacy was her weapon. There would be no chain of custody to question, no opportunity for Vane to claim she had fabricated it in a dark room. She had taken the truth and chained it to the glass, right in front of its keeper. As she was washing the plate, the man Ella had sent to the poisoned pools burst into the office, his horse lathered. "Mr. Rourke, Judge Jericho sent me. We found him, Crick." He was at the pools, trying to bury the salt sacks. Gideon's head snapped up. "Where is he?" "The judge is holding him at the site. She says to come now, and to bring the proof." Gideon looked at Tessa. She nodded, carefully sliding the wet, dripping plate into her protective box. "Go, I'm right behind you." When Gideon rode up, the scene at the upstream pools was a tableau of defeated arrogance. Barlow Crick was on his knees by the salt-crusted rocks, his hands bound. Judge Jericho sat on her horse, her shotgun aimed at his head. The half-buried burlap sacks were piled beside him. "He was trying to destroy the evidence," Ella said, her voice flat. "He's been talking, but not enough." Gideon dismounted. He walked over to Crick. He didn't look angry. He looked cold. "It's over, Crick," Gideon said. "We have the plates. We have the ledgers. We have you." Crick, his face sullen, spat into the poisoned water. "You got nothing. Vane will have me out by sundown. He'll have you all in a box." "Why?" Gideon asked, his voice quiet. "Why all this? It's not just the water, the DeLeons, the ambush. Why?" "You're a fool, Rourke," Crick sneered, finally looking up. His eyes filled with a petty, vicious pride. "You think this is about water for a train? That's what we tell the newspapers." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Vane doesn't care about your water. He cares about your ground. That line shack of yours, it's sitting on the richest vein of granite in this territory. Perfect for ballast. And your ranch, it's the only level pass to build a spur line directly to the quarry." Crick grinned, revealing broken teeth. "He doesn't want to buy your land, Rourke. He wants to take it. He wants to dig it up, crush it, and sell it back to the main line by the ton. The water, the reservoir. That was just the excuse to clear you out. You were never just in the way. You were the prize." Gideon went still. It was as if the world had suddenly snapped into a terrible, sharp focus. The forged notice, the eminent domain, the harassment. It was never random. The fight had always had his name on it. The loner was never, ever, left alone. "He wanted my ground," Gideon repeated, the word tasting like ash. "And he'll get it," Crick lunged, his bound hands snapping free. He had been working a small blade, a hideout knife, and had cut his ropes. He didn't run. He grabbed an adze, a heavy wood-shaping tool, left by his men. He raised it high and brought it down, aiming to split Gideon's skull. Gideon didn't have time to draw. He reacted, grabbing the closest thing to him, a branding iron left by the DeLeons, which Ella's men had recovered. He raised it, catching the adze handle on the iron shaft, the wood and metal connecting with a vicious thwack. Crick, mad with desperation, swung again, the heavy, curved blade of the adze whistling through the air. Gideon parried, the branding iron ringing like a bell. It was a primal fight, Vane's man, the builder, the destroyer, with his wood-cutting tool, against the rancher, his identity, his brand. Crick was stronger, but Gideon was faster. He sidestepped a wild swing, brought the heavy J of the branding iron around in a short arc, and slammed it into Crick's wrist. The adze fell from his nerveless fingers. Gideon reversed the iron, pressing the hot, unlit head against Crick's throat, pinning him against the rocks. "You will talk," Gideon hissed, his voice a low promise of violence. "You will tell the judge everything." Crick, his eyes wide with terror, His windpipe compressed, nodded frantically. When they returned to town, the mood had changed. The news of the seized records, of Crick's capture, had spread like wildfire. The hush of fear was turning into a murmur of possibility. Judge Ella Jericho convened her court again. In the dirt of the main square, she placed a rickety table by the well. "This court is back in session." She signed the temporary injunction, a sweeping order that halted all of Vane's operations, froze his assets, and voided the eminent domain claim, pending a full territorial trial. But she had no official seal. She turned to the town preacher. "Reverend, I need to borrow your baptismal set, the one with the territorial seal." A minute later, she was pressing the borrowed brass stamp into a pool of hot sealing wax on the document. "Law," she declared to the crowd, "is not a fancy stamp in Santa Fe. Law is where you raise it. It's the will of the people. And today, the will is for justice." Silas Vane, flanked by two new, hard-faced men, pushed through the crowd. "This is a travesty. A kangaroo court. This document is meaningless. I have federal friends. Judge, powerful friends. They will hear of this. I will have your bench." Ella Jericho smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Then you should wire them, Mr. Vane, immediately. You'll find the telegraph office is open. I've taken the liberty of placing it under my personal protection. Go ahead, send your wire. Tell your friends what's happened. Tell them about the murders. Tell them about the forged ledgers." Vane froze. His bluff called. The telegraph line was the only way out, and Ella now controlled it. Tessa and Gideon didn't wait. They took a long length of laundry line from the general store and strung it between two awning posts, right in the center of the square, one by one. Tessa hung her glass plates from the line with wooden clips. The surveyor's pin, the poisoned pool, with Crick caught in the act, and the final, damning plate, the forged ledger, her father's real survey beside it. They were not just photographs. They were scripture. The townsfolk, who had lived in fear of Vane's whispers and paper, gathered. They saw the images sunlit and undeniable. They read the truth with their own eyes. The murmur grew. It was a low, dangerous rumble of a power finally awakening. From the alley across the street, a shadow moved. Flint Mallory, his face bruised and swollen, his nose a broken mess, slunk toward the telegraph shack. He was no longer a professional. He was a cornered rat. He knelt by the wall, uncoiling a fuse, a stick of dynamite in his hand. If Vane couldn't use the wire, no one would. He struck a match. "Gideon!" Tessa's voice was a sharp cry. She had never stopped watching, her senses honed by the ambush. She didn't wait for Gideon. She sprinted across the square, her boot heels digging into the dirt. Mallory looked up, his eyes wide with panic, and touched the match to the fuse. It sputtered, sparked, and caught. Tessa didn't slow down. She reached the hissing, sparkling wire and stomped on it, grinding the burning fuse into the dirt with her heel. Again and again, until the spark was dead. She stood breathing heavily, her foot on the dead fuse, staring down the man who had tried to kill her. Mallory scrambled to his feet and vanished back into the shadows. The town, seeing it all, surged. The rumble became a roar. They had their proof. They had their judge. And they had their heroes. Vane, seeing the tide turn, seeing his power evaporate in the harsh, honest sunlight, retreated to his hotel, a prisoner in his own town. The cornered rats were chewing at the trap. The night did not bring peace. It brought a tense, watchful quiet to Coyote's Gate. Judge Jericho had turned the telegraph office into her command post, a single, defiant lamp burning in its window. Gideon and Tessa had taken rooms at the boarding house, not to sleep, but to wait for the dawn. The town was a powder keg. The fuse lit, and every soul in it was waiting for the explosion. From his window, Gideon watched the street, his mind a maelstrom. He saw the fire in the livery, tasted the ash-kissed desperation of his kiss with Tessa. He had spent a decade building walls around a life that consisted of little more than horses and silence. In 2 days, she had kicked them all down. He felt a terrifying, exhilarating hope he had long since buried. Tessa, in her room, was cleaning her plates, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. She was polishing her weapons. Each plate was a bullet, each image a truth aimed at the heart of Silas Vane's empire of lies. She was no longer just avenging her father. She was fighting for Gideon, for the De Leons, for the parched, abused land itself. The explosion came just before midnight, not as a gunshot, but as a bloom of orange light on the western horizon, a terrible, silent, pulsing glow that painted the undersides of the clouds in the color of hellfire. Gideon saw it first. He went completely still. His mind, faster than any horse, calculated the distance, the direction. There was only one thing out there. Mesquite Crossing, his ranch, his barn. "No," he whispered, the sound a raw, hollow thing. Tessa saw it a moment later. She burst into his room without knocking. He was already pulling on his boots, his face a mask of such profound, terrible grief she felt her own heart crack. The ghosts of his solitary life, the years of quiet work, the memories of every horse he had ever gentled, were all going up in that orange blaze. "Gideon." He didn't answer. He moved past her, a man sleepwalking through a nightmare. He was a force of nature, his righteous fury checked by a deep, soul-shaking sorrow. He hit the street at a run, heading for the corral where they'd stabled the horses. Tessa was right behind him. He threw a bridle over the roan's head, not bothering with a saddle. He swung onto the horse's bare back in a single, fluid motion, his jaw set like iron, his eyes wet with unshed tears. This was not a strategic move. This was a man riding into the heart of his own personal inferno. Tessa's mind worked with a cold, desperate clarity. She didn't try to stop him. She grabbed a bucket from the town well and her heavy box of plates from the wagon. She saddled her mule, her hands moving with a frantic, focused energy. Save what can be saved. It was the creed of her life. They rode out of town like twin furies, leaving the shouting townsfolk and Ella's deputies in their wake. The ride was a mad, desperate gallop through the moonlit dark, the orange glow on the horizon growing brighter, hotter, a malevolent sun. When they arrived, the scene was an opera of destruction. The great barn, the one Gideon had built with his own hands, was a roaring cathedral of flame. The roof was gone. The walls were collapsing inward, sending up a geyser of sparks that danced against the night sky. The heat was a physical blow, the sound a continuous, deafening roar. Gideon slid from his horse, his face illuminated by the fire that was consuming his life. He just stood there, his hands clenched, his body trembling with a rage so profound it had no voice. Tessa ran to the small line shack, the only structure still standing. The fire was spreading, the dry grass catching, the flames licking at the corral fence. She began throwing buckets of water from the trough onto the shack's roof, a desperate, hopeless effort against the overwhelming heat. A gunshot cracked through the roar of the flames. The bullet splintered the wood of the water trough, a foot from Tessa's head. She cried out, dropping the bucket, and threw herself to the ground. "Mallory!" Gideon roared, his grief instantly replaced by a cold, deadly focus. High in the hayloft of the neighboring, smaller stable, the only part not yet fully engulfed, a figure was silhouetted against the flames. Flint Mallory. He was perched like a vulture, a rifle in his hands, picking his targets in the chaos. Gideon drew his pistol, but Mallory was in shadow. A difficult shot. He fired once, the bullet thudding into the hayloft wall. Mallory fired back, the bullet kicking up dirt near Gideon's feet. Tessa, on the ground, crawled toward her chemical box. An idea, born of desperation and a deep, intimate knowledge of her craft, bloomed in her mind. Her flash powder. She pulled out the small, sealed tin. It was a volatile mixture of magnesium and potassium chlorate. She unscrewed the lid, her heart hammering. She had a handful of pure, blinding light.
"Gideon!"
she screamed.
"Draw his fire!"
Gideon understood instantly. He stood up, making himself a clear target, and fired twice at the hayloft, forcing Mallory to duck back. Now, Tessa stood, took a step back, and with a flick of her wrist, threw the open tin of powder into the air, toward the hayloft opening. For a second, it hung there, a cloud of fine, gray dust. Then, a stray ember from the burning barn drifted into it. The world went white. The powder ignited with a deafening thwomp, a concussive blast of pure, brilliant magnesium light, brighter than the sun. It was as if a piece of a star had fallen into the yard. Mallory screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. He had been staring directly at it. He dropped his rifle, clutching his eyes, stumbling back from the hayloft opening, completely and utterly blinded. In that moment of white light, Gideon saw him. His arm came up, his pistol steady. He could have ended it. He could have put a bullet through Mallory's heart. Instead, he aimed lower. He fired once, deliberately. Mallory cried out again, a sharp yelp of pain, and clutched his shoulder, stumbling out of sight. The shot was non-lethal. It was a message. Gideon was not a murderer. He was a judge. The sound of hoofbeats thundered from the darkness. Barlow Crick, his face a mask of crazed fury, rode out from behind the burning barn, a heavy axe in his hand. He must have been the one to set the fire. Seeing his sniper disabled, he charged, not at Gideon, but at Tessa. Gideon didn't have time to reload. He dropped his pistol, spun, and grabbed his lariat from his saddle. Crick was 20 yards away, his horse at a full gallop, the axe raised high. Gideon built his loop in 2 smooth, practiced motions. He swung it once, twice, a perfect, whistling circle in the firelight. He let it fly. The rope snaked through the air, a living thing. The loop dropped perfectly over Crick's head and shoulders, cinching tight around his arms. Gideon dug his heels in, bracing. The rope snapped taut. Crick was yanked from the saddle as if by the hand of God. He flew through the air and hit the ground hard, a cloud of dust and a grunt of pain. He lay there, gasping, the fight knocked out of him. He ate dust, and then came the confession. Gideon was on him in a second, hauling him to his feet. "Who ordered it? Crick?" Gideon's voice was a low, dangerous whisper. "Who ordered the De Leon burn?" "Go to hell, Rourke." Crick spat, a string of bloody saliva on his lips. Gideon tightened his grip, his knuckles white. "You're already there. Talk." "It was vain," Crick finally screamed, his bravado shattering. "It was all vain. He ordered it. He ordered the De Leon burn. He ordered the well salting. He said to drive the prices down, to make them desperate so they'd sell for pennies. He said to burn you out, to make an example of you." The ugly, brutal truth hung in the air, illuminated by the dying flames of Gideon's life. A new sound joined the crackle of the fire, the thunder of a dozen horses. Judge Ella Jericho, with her hastily formed posse, crested the rise, their faces grim in the firelight. They took in the scene: the burning barn, the captured Crick, the wounded Mallory stumbling from the stable with his hands in the air. Ella slid from her horse. "It seems, Mr. Crick," she said, her voice cold as a grave, "you have a great deal more to tell me." They took Crick back to the telegraph office, the only place in town with a lamp bright enough to write by. Tessa sat at the desk, a pen in her hand, a blank sheet of paper in front of her. Ella stood over Crick, her shotgun resting on the table. Under the harsh, steady light of the lamp, Crick's story spilled out, a torrent of poison. He confessed everything: Vane's entire conspiracy, the land grab, the intimidation, the arson. Tessa's pen scratched across the paper, the only sound in the room. Every word was a nail, every sentence a plank. She was not taking a photograph. She was building a gallows. ink as gallows. As Crick signed his confession, his hands shaking, a boy burst into the office. "Judge, it's Vane. He's gone. He took a horse from the hotel stable and he's riding out, hard, toward the trestle." Gideon and Tessa looked at each other. They knew instantly.
The dynamite?
Tessa breathed. "He's going to blow the rails," Gideon finished. "Blame it on sabotage, create enough chaos to cover his escape." They didn't wait for Ella's orders. They ran. They mounted up, their horses already saddled, and spurred them into a gallop, chasing the ghost of Silas Vane into the moon-drenched night. They gave chase along a narrow, winding canyon trail known as Rattlesnake Cut. The moon was high and full, a silver coin in the black sky, painting their speed in strokes of white and shadow. They rode as one, their horses stretched out, their bodies low, two riders with a single purpose. They were neck and neck, the wind tearing at their faces. Tessa, her hair flying behind her, looked over at Gideon. His face was a mask of pure, righteous fury, beautiful and terrible in the moonlight. She was filled with a wild, terrifying joy. She laughed, a sound that was half a sob, half a cheer. "Keep up, Rourke!" she yelled over the thunder of their hooves. He turned his head, and in the moonlight, she saw him smile, a true, real smile. "I'm already there," he said. They burst from the cut just in time to see Vane at the far end of the trestle. He was on foot, a length of fuse sputtering in his hand. He had already placed the charges. "Vane," Gideon roared. Vane looked up, his face a pale oval of panic. He dropped the lit fuse and ran for his horse. The fuse hissed, a small, angry snake of sparks eating its way toward a crate marked "Danger." There was no time. Gideon didn't slow down. As his horse reached the edge of the gorge, he launched himself from its back, a desperate, flying leap. He landed hard on the wooden decking of the trestle, rolling, and scrambled toward the hissing fuse. Tessa reined in her mule, pulling the canteen from her saddle. It was her last. She spurred the mule onto the first few planks of the bridge, leaned down, and poured the precious water over the sputtering line. The fuse went out with a final, defiant sizzle, a plume of wet smoke rising into the night. They had saved it. Vane, seeing his plan foiled, his escape cut off, let out a scream of pure, animal rage. He pulled a pistol from his coat, his hands shaking. He didn't aim at Gideon. He aimed at Tessa. Gideon saw it. He threw himself sideways, interposing his body just as Vane fired. The shot was wild. The bullet didn't hit Gideon. It tore through the brim of his hat, spinning it from his head. The sound a sharp, angry zip past his ear. That was all the opening Tessa needed. She slid from her mule and charged. Before Vane could fire again, she kicked out, her boot connecting squarely with his wrist. The pistol flew from his grasp, arcing through the air, and vanished into the blackness of the gorge below. Vane stood there, disarmed, defeated, his chest heaving. The sound of horses surrounded them. Judge Ella Jericho and her posse had arrived, their guns drawn, their faces hard in the moonlight. A single limping figure was with them, his hands raised in surrender. Flint Mallory, his pride burned down to the simple, ugly truth, had led them here. It was over. The sun rose on a new kind of day in Coyote's Gate. It was not the familiar, oppressive heat of Vane's reign, but a clear, sharp, honest light. The sky, finally free of smoke, was an endless, pale blue. The court was not held in the dirt this time. It was held on the railroad platform, the very symbol of Vane's power. The charred, half-blown rails of the trestle visible in the distance, a backdrop of his failed tyranny. There was no official bench. Judge Ella Jericho stood at a simple wooden crate, her shotgun leaning against it. On one side stood Silas Vane, his fine suit rumpled and stained, his silver hair in disarray. He was flanked by two grim-faced deputies, their rifles held ready. On the other side stood Flint Mallory, his arm in a crude sling, his broken face a mask of purple and yellow, and Barlow Crick, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. But the jury was the entire town. They had gathered in the plaza, a silent, unmoving sea of dust and sweat, their faces turned toward the platform. Miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and the widows of the men Vane's ambition had crushed. They were a jury of the wronged, and their presence was a weight heavier than any law book. Tessa and Gideon stood at the front of the crowd, just below the platform. They were not accused, not witnesses in the traditional sense. They were the truth-tellers, the ones who had dragged the crimes into the light. Judge Ella Jericho raised her hand. A hush fell over the plaza. She did not bang a gavel. Her voice was all the authority she needed, and it carried in the clear morning air. "This hearing is convened," she declared, her voice ringing. "Silas Vane, you are charged before this body, the people of the New Mexico Territory, with conspiracy to commit fraud, the illegal seizure of land and water rights, arson, assault with intent to harm, and the murder of territorial deputies Elias Thorne and Samuel Potter." A low, dangerous sound rumbled through the crowd at the names of the dead. Vane, his arrogance returning like a reflex, sneered. "This is preposterous. You have no authority, old woman. By the time the federal marshals arrive, I will be a free man, and you will be in a cell for kidnapping." "Authority," Ella said, her voice dangerously calm, "is a thing you earn, or a thing you take. You, Mr. Vane, did the latter, and the people are now taking it back." She turned to Tessa. "Miss Lockhart, present the evidence." Tessa and Gideon moved as one. They had strung a long laundry rope between two of the platform's support posts. With a steady hand, Tessa began to hang her glass plates from the line, one by one. Using wooden clips, the morning sun, rising behind her, struck the glass. The images glowed, illuminated from behind, as if by a divine light. The crowd surged forward, a collective, indrawn breath. There it was, the forged surveyor's pin, standing in the dirt next to Gideon's boot, the burned-out shell of the De Leon homestead, the poisoned pool, with Crick caught in the act, the white salt tumbling into the clear water, and finally, the most damning, the two ledgers. Side by side, the faked date, the lie next to the truth. They were not just pictures. They were a silent, undeniable testimony. The townsfolk read the images like scripture, their quiet, simmering anger growing into a palpable, solid thing. "Tricks," Vane spat. "Shadows and light. It proves nothing." "Then let's add some words." Ella said. She turned her steel-gray eyes on Flint Mallory. "Mr. Mallory, you were Mr. Vane's enforcer. You attempted to murder Miss Lockhart, and Mr. Rourke, you ambushed my men. The penalty for that is hanging." Mallory, his face slick with sweat, his professional veneer entirely stripped away, looked from Ella's unmoving face to the silent, watching crowd. He saw no mercy there. He saw only a rope. He was a man of cold calculation, and he was making his final calculation. "I'll bargain," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. Vane's head snapped around. "Mallory, you snake, keep your mouth shut!" "And hang for you," Mallory laughed, a bitter, painful sound. "I don't think so. I was an employee. Judge, I followed orders. But I also kept records." He reached into his coat with his good hand and produced a slim oilskin packet. Vane was arrogant. He liked to telegraph his friends in Santa Fe, the territorial legislators, the land agents. He liked to boast of his progress. He tossed the packet onto the crate. "Those are the wire copies. Every telegram he sent, every order he gave, every bribe he paid. The names, the dates, the amounts. It's all there." Names began to fall from Ella's lips as she read. Names that made the crowd gasp. Territorial senators, Federal land agents, names of powerful men, all implicated, all tied to Vane's web. The names fell like heavy iron horseshoes onto the platform. Vane's face, which had been red with bluster, turned the color of ash. He was no longer just a tyrant in a small town. He was a man who had implicated the very government that was supposed to protect it.
And you, Mr. Crick,
Ella said, turning her attention to the foreman.
You signed a confession. Do you stand by it before these people?
Barlow Crick, who had been staring at his boots, looked up. He looked at the crowd, at the hard, unforgiving faces. Then he looked at Tessa's plates, fluttering on the line. His gaze fixed on the image of the De Leon homestead, the blackened ruin. His face, hard and cruel, crumpled. A dry, racking sob broke from his chest.
I did it,
he whispered, his voice breaking.
Vane, he ordered it. He told us to make an example, to burn them out.
He looked at the crowd, his eyes wild with a sudden, desperate need for absolution. But the De Leons, Maria and Tomas, they were good people. They never hurt anyone. His voice dropped to a whisper.
He ordered the well salting. He told us to drive the prices down, to make 'em run. It was all him, all of it.
A profound, terrible silence settled over the plaza. Crick's confession, more than the telegrams, more than the plates, was the final nail. It was the human cost, spoken aloud. Judge Ella Jericho let the silence hang for a long moment, letting the weight of the truth settle onto every soul. Then she raised her head.
Silas Vane,
she said, her voice like the crack of a judge's gavel.
This court finds you guilty. Your federal charter is a fraud, built on a mountain of lies and soaked in the blood of good men,
by the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico. I hereby void the eminent domain claim on Mesquite Crossing and all adjacent properties. It is null. She pointed to the telegraph office. I am assigning receivership of the Coyotes Gate Bank and all assets of the Vane Railroad Company to the Territorial Magistrate's office, pending a full audit. She turned to a deputy.
Wire Santa Fe. Tell them we have 3 murderers in custody and a conspiracy that reaches the capital. Tell them to send the marshals. Not Vane's friends, the real ones.
A great, collective sigh moved through the crowd. It was not a cheer. It was an exhale. The sound of 1,000 pounds of pressure being lifted from their chests. The danger was over. But danger is a habit you unlearn slow. The town had been holding its breath for so long. It was almost afraid to breathe free air. In that quiet, shared moment, Gideon's hand found Tessa's. He didn't look at her. He just slipped his large, calloused hand over hers, his fingers lacing through hers. He squeezed once, a simple, powerful message that passed between them. Still here. She squeezed back, her heart so full it ached. She reached into her satchel and pulled out his hat. It was dusty and smelled of smoke, and on the brim, there was a clean, sharp crease where Vane's bullet had passed. She held it out to him.
You lost this,
she said softly. He took it, his eyes meeting hers. He ran his thumb over the crease, a small, grim smile touching his lips. It's a wedding notch, he murmured. What?
Something old, something new, something borrowed, something creased.
He settled the hat back on his head, the angle just a little more defiant than before. It suits me. Tessa smiled, a real bright smile that lit her whole face.
So does victory.
Up on the platform, Judge Jericho was watching them. She stepped down, her work done, and approached Tessa. She nodded toward the oilskin packet containing Tessa's father's survey.
That's a fine piece of work, that survey,
Ella said.
It was my father's,
Tessa said, her voice thick with emotion. It was, Ella agreed. But he's gone, and his seal was forged. When you file it in Santa Fe, and you will not file it under his name. Tessa looked at her, confused. Ella pointed a stern finger at her.
You will get your own surveyor's seal. Miss Lockhart, you will file the Lockhart survey under your name, with your seal. Your father did the work. You made it loud. The thought was staggering. Her own seal, her own name. It was more than an inheritance. It was a mantle. Thank you, Judge, she whispered. Ella nodded, then looked at Gideon, who was standing quietly by Tessa's side, a man who seemed to be learning how to stand in the light. Mr. Rourke, you have your ranch back, what's left of it. It's enough, Gideon said. Tessa turned to him as Ella walked away, leaving them in their own small pocket of peace. She looked at his face, at the quiet in his eyes. What will you do now? She asked. With all this quiet. Gideon looked away from her, toward the distant, hazy line of the horizon, the one he had ridden alone for so many years. He was quiet for a long moment, as if tasting the word. The quiet was good for a long time, he said, his voice low. It was safe. He turned his gaze back to her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. He was looking at her like she was the horizon, like she was a new, unknown territory he wanted to ride toward, and daily. But it's just empty. He gave a small, half-smile. Maybe I'll fill it. Across the plaza, the spell was breaking. The crowd was not dispersing. They were turning to each other. A man clapped his neighbor on the shoulder. A woman began to sweep the soot from her boardwalk. 2 men picked up a fallen awning beam from the burned-out livery. The smoke was thinning. The sky was growing honest. The town, with its heart ripped out and its future stolen, was beginning to repair what it could, together. The wind, no longer an enemy, combed through the tall grass of painted mesa. It was a new sound, a sibilant, cleansing whisper that carried the scent of wet earth and growing things. Down in the valley, the silver thread wash, the artery Tessa had saved, ran clear and bright over the stones. It had a voice now, a happy, chuckling sound of abundance. The land was breathing again. At Mesquite Crossing, the skeleton of the great barn stood as a black monument to Vane's rage. But it was not a place of defeat. It was a place of becoming. Gideon Rourke was rebuilding his corral. He was not alone. The men from Coyote's Gate were there. Mr. Abernathy, the general store proprietor who had once peered at Gideon with suspicion, was now handing him fresh-cut pine rails. The preacher, his sleeves rolled up, was helping to set a new gate post. They had come not for pay, but for a stake in their own future. They had come to raise a beam for a man who had, against his every instinct, fought for them all. Gideon moved through the work with his usual quiet economy, but the silence around him was gone. It was replaced by the thud of mallets, the scrape of saws, and the occasional, hesitant sound of laughter. He was a man accustomed to the solitude of his own hammer striking an anvil. Now, his hammer strike was an echo, answered by 3 others. He was learning the rhythm of community, a language he had long forgotten, and he found it was a solid, sturdy thing beneath his feet. Tessa watched from the porch of the line shack, her heart a full, aching thing in her chest. She had spent the morning cleaning her gear, her hands stained with the familiar, axexionic smell of her chemicals. But she was watching him. He was still the man of winter shade and rope-burn hands. But he was no longer an island. The town was anchoring itself to him. He was becoming the center of the world he had only meant to observe. As the sun began to dip, painting the clouds in shades of apricot and rose, the men packed their tools. They clapped Gideon on his good shoulder, nodded to Tessa with a new, deep respect, and rode back to town, their silhouettes dark against the golden sky. The quiet that settled over the ranch was different. It was not the empty, waiting silence of before. It was a shared peace, full and earned. Tessa walked over to him. He was testing the new gate, his hand running over the smooth wood. She was holding a flat, square package wrapped in oilcloth. I have something for you, she said, her voice soft. He turned, his face unreadable in the twilight. He took the package, his scarred fingers clumsy with the ties. He unwrapped it. It was a glass plate, but it was not evidence. It was framed in a simple, dark wood she had commissioned from the town carpenter. The image was the one she had taken in the line shack, the one she had developed under the ruby light. It was Gideon, his back to the camera, staring out the window at the rain, a silhouette of profound, stubborn loneliness. No, that was wrong. She held up the second gift. It was another plate, the one she had kept, the one she had taken secretly. It was him in the corral, his hand outstretched, his body curved in a gesture of pure, patient trust, gentling the killer Mustang. "This is how I see you," she whispered. "Not the man who turns away, the man who stays, the man who tames the wild, not by breaking it, but by offering it peace." He stared at the image, his throat working. He was a man who hated being aimed at, who saw the camera as a theft of his soul. But this was not a theft. It was a reflection. It was his own hidden strength, captured in silver and glass, given back to him. He ran a single finger over the image of the horse, then over the image of his own hand. He couldn't speak. He just nodded. A deep, slow acknowledgement that shook him to his core. He carefully set the framed plate against the porch rail, treating it as the fragile, sacred thing it was. "I have something for you, too," he said, his voice rough. He took her hand, his grip warm and sure, and led her not into the corral, but to the door of the line shack. The door frame was new, rebuilt with fresh-hewn pine that smelled sharp and clean. He had been working on it in secret. From his pocket, he pulled a heavy, rusted horseshoe, a relic he must have saved from the fire. He took a nail and his hammer. He reached up and, with 2 sure strikes, nailed the horseshoe above the door. He nailed it upside down, the ends pointing toward the ground. Tessa's breath caught. She knew the superstition. An upside-down horseshoe meant your luck ran out. It was a symbol of despair. "Gideon," she began, her voice full of a sudden, cold fear. Before she could finish, he took the hammer and, with a single, deft tap, struck the side of the horseshoe. It pivoted on the nail. He drove a second nail into the other hole, securing it. It was right side up. The ends pointed to the sky. "So the luck doesn't run out," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He tapped the iron curve. "So it catches, spills on us both." She looked at the horseshoe, a perfect, rusted crescent. A new covenant hung above the door to their future. She looked at him, at his earnest, hopeful face. And the love she felt for him was so potent it almost buckled her knees. The air between them changed. The work was done. The gifts were given. The ghosts were laid to rest. Now, there was only the promise, the one that had hung in the air since that first rain-soaked day. She stepped closer, her eyes bright and full of a challenging, playful fire. "About that promise," she murmured, her voice a low tease that was just for him. "The one from the storm." He knew. His gaze darkened, his focus narrowing to her, and her alone. "I'll ride you harder than that horse," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. He was stunned. And then it came. The grin. It was not the small, grim smile she had come to know. It was the other one, the one that was just for her, the slow, wrecking, beautiful grin that transformed his entire face, stripping away the solitude and revealing the man beneath a man quiet and hungry and stunned by his own capacity for joy. He let out a short, rough laugh. "Name the trail." He didn't lead her into the line shack, to the narrow cot. He took her hand and led her to the newly rebuilt stable, the one that had been saved from the fire. The air inside was sweet with the smell of new wood, clean hay, and oiled leather. A single lantern cast a pool of liquid gold, turning the small space into a sanctuary. He turned to her, and the grin was gone, replaced by a look of such profound, tender awe that it took her breath away.
He reached out, his scarred, rough hand tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing her lower lip. Her own stained, chemical-kissed hands came up to his chest. Feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart, she leaned into his touch. This was not the desperate, ash-tasted kiss of the fire. This was the slow, sure kiss that had waited in the cave, the one they had earned. Their hands began to learn what their trust already knew. His fingers found the small buttons on her shirt, his touch hesitant, respectful. Her hands traced the ladder of scars on his ribs, not with pity or curiosity, but with a familiar, loving acceptance. There was only the sound of their breathing, a soft hitch in her throat, a low groan from deep in his chest. There was the rustle of clothing falling onto the clean hay, the scent of his skin, the gold of the lantern light painting their shadows on the new wooden wall. The two silhouettes merged, becoming one, a new geometry of a life shared. There was a low, soft laugh from her, a quiet rumble from him, the sound of two solitary souls finally, truly, finding their home in each other. Outside, in the new, free territory, the silver thread wash ran clear and strong, a silver ribbon in the moonlight, upstream, at the poisoned pools. The empty salt sacks rotted in the sun, their power gone, the land already healing. At the Coyote's Gate depot, Silas Vane sat on a hard bench, his fine suit soiled, his wrists shackled to the railway, waiting for the federal train, tacked to the wall beside him. For all the town to see was Judge Ella Jericho's injunction, the borrowed church seal cooling in the night air. In the corral at Mesquite Crossing, a mustang whickered, a soft, gentle sound, like a blessing on the night. Inside the stall, Tessa's camera sat on a bale of hay. She reached out one hand from the warm embrace that held her and clicked the lens cap on. She was not a witness tonight. She would keep this picture for her heart, not for the rope. Gideon gathered her closer, his strength a solid, grounding presence. He lifted her, his voice a rough, desperate, beautiful whisper against her ear. Stay. It was not a question. It was a plea. It was the final wall of his solitude crumbling to dust. Tessa smiled against his skin, her lips finding the pulse in his throat. She wrapped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to him. Try and make me leave. The lantern flame climbed, a bright, steady, golden tear against the dark. The camera shutter stayed still. The story held its breath at the exact brink of everything they earned. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Please drop a comment below. Share your thoughts, and let's build a community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you enjoyed this story, please support us by hitting that hype button to help it reach more listeners.